They said a woman with witch blood in her veins would never survive a public rejection. They were wrong. Lady Evelyne Drakhar stood before the entire Moonveil Kingdom and watched her world burn without shedding a single tear. When the man promised to her since childhood called her unworthy, she didn't beg, she didn't break. And that refusal to crumble caught the attention of the most dangerous man in the North, the Alpha King himself. What happens when this girl everyone rejected becomes the one woman a frozen king cannot live without? Stay with me until the end of this story. You're going to want to see how a half-blood witch brings an empire to its knees. And if this kind of raw power speaks to you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. Let me know where my tribe is watching from. The great hall of Moonveil Palace smelled like roses and lies. Evelyne could taste both on her tongue as she stood at the center of the marble floor, surrounded by 1,000 faces that wanted to watch her bleed. The ceiling soared 3 stories high, painted with scenes of ancient wolf kings conquering kingdoms and claiming mates under full moons. Chandeliers dripped crystal light across nobles dressed in silk and smugness. Every eye in that room was fixed on her, waiting for the performance they'd paid to see. The humiliation of a half-blood witch daughter who dared to dream she could marry into a pure bloodline. Evelyne's hands were steady at her sides. Her spine was iron straight beneath the ceremonial gown they'd forced her into that morning. White silk, because they wanted her to look like a bride right before they destroyed her. Delicate lace at the throat, because they wanted everyone to see her pulse jump when the rejection came. She'd known what this dress meant the moment the servants brought it to her chamber. They wanted a show. Lord Damien Ashford stood 10 feet away from her, golden and perfect in his formal leathers, the crest of House Ashford blazing across his chest in silver thread. He was beautiful the way a sword was beautiful. All sharp edges and cold purpose. The boy she'd known since childhood was gone. The man who stood before the court now wore cruelty like a second skin. His voice carried through the silent hall. Lady Evelyne Drakhar, I reject you as my intended mate. The words landed like stones in still water. Ripples of shock moved through the crowd, even though everyone had known this was coming. Formal rejections were rare. Most noble families simply broke betrothals quietly, behind closed doors, with lawyers and land negotiations smoothing over the mess. But Damien's family had wanted this. Public, brutal. A message to every other bloodline in the kingdom. Witch blood would not infiltrate their house. Evelyne didn't flinch. She'd prepared for this moment for weeks. Ever since Damien's mother had cornered her in the garden and told her exactly what would happen if she didn't leave quietly. Lady Ashford had offered money, a small estate on the border. Enough gold to live comfortably if Evelyne disappeared and never spoke the family name again. Evelyne had refused, so they'd chosen violence instead. Damien continued, his voice growing stronger, playing to the crowd now. Your bloodline is tainted. Your mother was a sorceress who practiced forbidden magic, and her crimes stain you. I will not bind my house to corruption. I will not give my children a mother whose very existence is an insult to our ancestors. Someone in the crowd gasped. Another voice murmured agreement, the sound built like a wave, low and hungry. Evelyne felt heat crawl up her neck, not from shame, but from rage so pure it nearly choked her. She breathed through her nose and kept her face blank. Empty. They wanted tears. They wanted her to collapse, to beg, to prove every ugly thing they believed about women with power in their veins. She would give them nothing. When Damien finished his speech, silence dropped over the hall like a burial shroud. Every person in that room held their breath, waiting for Evelyne's response. Tradition demanded she speak. Acceptance or defiance, either one would satisfy the ritual. Evelyne lifted her chin and met Damien's eyes. I accept your rejection, Lord Ashford. Her voice didn't shake, didn't break. Each word was a blade, clean and precise. I release you from all bonds between our houses. May you find a mate worthy of your standards. The last sentence carried just enough edge that a few nobles in the front row shifted uncomfortably. Damien's jaw tightened. He'd expected her to fight, expected drama, maybe even hoped she'd use magic, give him an excuse to have her arrested right there in front of everyone. Instead, Evelyne simply bowed her head in formal acknowledgement and turned toward the exit. That's when she felt it, a pressure in the air that hadn't been there a moment before. Heavy and cold and absolute, like winter itself had walked into the room. Evelyne froze mid-step. Around her, the crowd's murmurs died instantly. Not fading, just gone, cut off as if someone had stolen the breath from every throat simultaneously. She turned back slowly. The royal balcony overlooked the great hall from the eastern wall, reserved for visiting dignitaries and royalty of sufficient rank. Evelyne had barely registered it earlier. Moonveil was a tributary kingdom. They didn't often host rulers powerful enough to warrant that platform. But someone stood there now. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in black and silver armor that seemed to drink the light around it. His hair was dark, cut short, and his face was all brutal angles and sharp edges. Scars marked his throat and the backs of his hands. Everything about him screamed violence held on a leash. Alpha King Kaelric Thornvale, ruler of the Northern Empire, conqueror of the Frostlands, the man whose armies had crushed 3 rebellions before he turned 25. He was a legend whispered about in strategy rooms and bedtime warnings. 14 years on the throne and not a single mate bond. No queen, no heirs, just ice and iron and a reputation for executing enemies so thoroughly their families forgot they'd ever existed. What the hell was he doing here? Kaelric's eyes locked onto Evelyne across the distance, and she felt the impact of that gaze like a physical touch. Cold. Assessing. Hungry in a way that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with predators recognizing prey. Then he moved. Not walked. Moved. Faster than a man in full armor should be able to move, crossing the balcony and descending the marble stairs in seconds. The crowd parted for him like water, nobles pressing themselves against walls and pillars to avoid being in his path. Even Damien stepped back, his earlier confidence crumbling. Kaelric stopped directly in front of Evelyne. Up close, he was worse. Taller than any man she'd ever seen, with eyes the color of a frozen lake and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile years ago. The temperature around him dropped. Evelyne could see her own breath misting in the air between them. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled. The kind of quiet that made smart people shut their mouths and listen. You accepted his rejection. It wasn't a question, but Evelyne answered anyway. Yes. Why didn't you fight? The question caught her off guard. Everyone else in this room thought her acceptance was weakness, surrender, proof she knew her place. But Kaelric asked like he genuinely wanted to understand. Evelyne met his eyes and didn't look away. Because begging a man to love me would be a bigger humiliation than anything he could do to me here. Something flickered across Kaelric's face. Not quite approval, not quite interest. Something older and darker and infinitely more dangerous. He turned toward Damien, who stood frozen several feet away, all his earlier bravado gone. You called her unworthy. Damien swallowed hard. My king, I meant no disrespect to. You rejected her because of witch blood. Yes, my lord, the laws are clear about Kaelric's voice dropped another degree, and the temperature in the hall plummeted with it. I didn't ask for a legal lecture. I asked you to confirm that you publicly rejected this woman because you consider her beneath you. Damien's face had gone white, but he managed a nod. Yes, my king. Good. Kaelric turned back to Evelyne, and before she could process what was happening, he reached out and caught her chin in his gloved hand. The touch was firm, but not painful, tilting her face up toward his. His thumb brushed the corner of her jaw. Every person in that hall stopped breathing. Your name, Kaelric said quietly. Evelyne Drakhar. How old are you? 22. Your mother's name? Seraphine Drakhar, she's dead. I know, she was executed for treason 8 years ago. The blunt statement should have hurt. Instead, Evelyne felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. Then why ask? Because I wanted to hear you say it without shame. He released her chin and stepped back, but his eyes never left hers. When he spoke again, his voice carried through the silent hall with absolute authority. Lord Ashford has rejected Lady Evelyne Drakhar and released all bonds between their houses. As is my right as Alpha King and sovereign of this territory, I claim those bonds as forfeit to the crown. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Evelyne's heart slammed against her ribs. Kaelric continued, each word precise and final. Evelyne Drakhar is now under the direct protection of the Northern Throne. Any insult to her is an insult to me. Any threat against her is an act of war against my empire. He turned his head slightly, addressing the entire hall now. She belongs to me now. The statement detonated through the great hall like a bomb. Nobles erupted into shocked whispers and frantic conversations. Damien looked like he'd been struck. His mother, Lady Ashford, swayed on her feet like she might faint. Evelyne couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except stand there while the most powerful man in 6 kingdoms claimed her like a piece of territory in front of 1,000 witnesses. Kaelric looked down at her, and for just a moment, something almost human flickered behind those frozen eyes. Do you accept my protection, Lady Drakhar? She should refuse, should spit in his face and walk out of this hall with whatever dignity she had left. But Evelyne had been playing survival games her entire life, and she recognized a lifeline when one appeared, even if it came wrapped in ice and threat. Yes, she said clearly. I accept. Then we're done here. Kaelric turned and walked toward the exit, his movements fluid and certain. After 3 steps, he paused and glanced back over his shoulder. Come, Evelyne, we leave for Frostmere within the hour. It took her a moment to realize he was waiting for her. Actually, waiting, like her answer mattered, like she had a choice. Evelyne gathered the skirts of her stupid white dress and followed the Alpha King out of Moonveil Palace while 1,000 nobles watched in stunned silence. The carriage that waited outside was black as pitch and built like a fortress on wheels. Armed guards surrounded it, each one wearing the silver wolf crest of the Northern Empire. They didn't speak, didn't react as Kaelric opened the door himself and gestured for Evelyne to enter. She climbed inside and immediately understood this wasn't a carriage meant for comfort. The interior was Spartan. Hard benches, no cushions, windows covered with iron bars. It looked more like a prisoner transport than royal transportation. Kaelric followed her inside and sat across from her, taking up far too much space in the confined area. The door slammed shut. A moment later, the carriage lurched into motion. Silence stretched between them. Evelyne counted her heartbeats and tried to make sense of what had just happened. 5 minutes ago, she'd been the rejected half-blood daughter of a dead witch. Now she was under the protection of the most feared ruler in the known world, being dragged north to a kingdom built on ice and war. She should be terrified. Instead, she felt oddly calm. Like the worst had already happened back in that hall, and everything after this was just details. Kaelric spoke first. You're not afraid. Should I be? Most people are. Most people didn't just get publicly humiliated in front of their entire kingdom. I'm fresh out of fear for the day. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. Fair enough. Evelyne studied him in the dim light filtering through the barred windows. Up close, she could see the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. The way he held himself too still, like movement required conscious effort. There was something wrong with him, something off. She'd seen enough dying men to recognize the signs. Why did you claim me? She asked bluntly. Because you didn't break. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting right now. Evelyne leaned back against the hard bench and crossed her arms. So I'm supposed to just follow you north without knowing why. Trust that the Alpha King, who hasn't taken a mate in 14 years, suddenly decided to claim a disgraced half-blood in front of a foreign court. Yes. And if I refuse? Kaelric's eyes locked onto hers, and the temperature in the carriage dropped 10 degrees. You already accepted my protection, Evelyne. There's no refusing now. You're mine until I say otherwise. The possessive certainty in his voice should have made her angry. Instead, it sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with cold. I'm not property, she said quietly. No, you're not. He tilted his head slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. But you are the first interesting thing to happen to me in a very long time, and I protect what interests me. Lucky me. Yes, lucky you. The carriage hit a rough patch of road, and Evelyne braced herself against the wall. Outside, she could hear the thunder of hooves as the guard escort kept pace. They were moving fast, too fast for a casual journey. This was a retreat, or an extraction. How long to Frostmere? She asked. 4 days if the weather holds. And when we arrive? You'll be given quarters in the palace. Servants, guards, everything you need. Everything except freedom. Kaelric's expression didn't change. Freedom is overrated. Safety is more valuable. Safety from what? He was quiet for a long moment, and Evelyn thought he might not answer. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, close enough that she could see the frost beginning to form along the edges of his armor. "There are things hunting me, Evelyn. Old things. Powerful things. They've been killing me slowly for years, and I've been fighting them alone because there was no other option." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But when you stood in that hall and refused to beg that fool for scraps, something changed. For the first time in 14 years, I felt warmth." Evelyn's breath caught. "What are you talking about?" "A curse. Placed on my bloodline 3 centuries ago. Every king of House Thornvale has died from it. Slowly, painfully. We lose our emotions first, our warmth, our humanity, until there's nothing left but ice and instinct." He pulled off one glove and Evelyn's stomach dropped. His hand was gray, not pale. Gray. Like stone. Like death. Frost crept along his knuckles and up his wrist, disappearing beneath his sleeve. "This is what I am," Kaelric said flatly. "A dying king holding on to the last pieces of himself. I have maybe 2 years left before the curse takes me completely. And then my empire will fall into chaos because I have no heir and no mate bond to anchor me to humanity." Evelyn stared at his ruined hand and felt something crack open in her chest. Horror. Pity. And underneath it all, a strange recognition. She knew what it was like to be marked by something you couldn't control, to carry your mother's sins in your blood. "Why tell me this?" she asked. Kaelric pulled his glove back on slowly. "Because when I stood near you in that hall, the ice receded. Just a fraction, just enough to feel my own heartbeat for the first time in months." He met her eyes. "I don't know why. I don't know how. But you did something to the curse just by existing in the same room as me. That's impossible. I've spent 14 years studying impossible magic trying to save my own life. Trust me when I say nothing is impossible anymore." The carriage rattled over another rough patch, and Evelyne gripped the edge of the bench to steady herself. Her mind was racing. A curse. Witch magic. And somehow she was connected to it. "What do you want from me?" she asked carefully. "I want you alive and near me, that's all. If your presence weakens the curse, then maybe I can buy myself enough time to find a real solution. And in exchange, you get protection, resources, and a life far better than what was waiting for you in Moonveil. So I'm medicine, a tool. Your survival, for both of us." Evelyn wanted to argue, wanted to demand he turn the carriage around and let her go. But she'd learned a long time ago that survival meant taking the opportunities that appeared even when they came wrapped in darkness. And Kaelric Thornvale, for all his frozen brutality, was offering her something no one else ever had. A purpose. "Fine," she said. "I'll come to Frostmere. I'll stay near you. But I want your word that I'm not a prisoner, that if I choose to leave, you'll let me go." Kaelric studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, sharp and final. "You have my word. You're not a prisoner, Evelyn. You're a guest. And if you choose to leave, I won't stop you. And if your court doesn't accept me," his smile was all teeth and ice, "then they'll learn what happens when they disrespect what belongs to the king." They traveled north for 4 days through territory that grew colder and wilder with each mile. Evelyn watched the landscape change through the barred windows. Green hills gave way to rocky plains, forests thickened and darkened. Snow appeared in patches, then drifts, then endless white fields stretching toward mountains that looked like broken teeth against the sky. Kaelric spent most of the journey silent, his eyes closed, breathing slow and controlled like he was fighting some invisible battle inside his own body. Occasionally his hand would spasm, and frost would spread across his armor before he forced it back with visible effort. Evelyn didn't try to make conversation. She'd seen enough to understand he was holding himself together through sheer will, and anything she said would just be noise. Instead, she thought about her mother. Seraphine Drakhar had been beautiful and brilliant, and completely destroyed by the time they executed her. Evelyn remembered the trial, the accusations of treason and forbidden magic, the way her mother had stood in chains and smiled like she knew a secret no one else could understand. They'd burned her on a pyre outside the city gates. Evelyn had been 14 years old, and she'd watched every second of it because her mother had made her promise. "Remember this," her mother had whispered the night before the execution. "Remember what they do to women with power. And when your time comes, Make them pay for every drop of blood. Evelyne had carried that promise for 8 years. Maybe now she'd finally get the chance to keep it. Mom. Frostmere Palace appeared on the 5th morning like something out of a nightmare. It wasn't built. It was carved. Massive walls of black stone and ice rose from the frozen ground, spiraling into towers that pierced the clouds. Banners bearing the silver wolf snapped in the brutal wind. The gates were iron and 15 feet tall, and when they opened, the sound echoed like breaking bones. The carriage rolled through into a courtyard that could have held 1,000 soldiers. Guards lined the walls. Servants moved through the snow in tight formations, their breath misting in the frozen air. Everything was precision, control, power. Kaelric opened the carriage door himself and stepped out into the cold like it didn't exist. Evelyne followed, and the wind hit her like a fist. She gasped and immediately felt ice crystals forming in her lungs. A heavy fur cloak dropped over her shoulders. She looked up and found Kaelric fastening it at her throat, his movements quick and efficient. "Breathe shallow until you adjust," he said quietly. "The cold here kills Southerners if they're not careful." Comforting. "I don't deal in comfort, I deal in facts." He turned and started toward the main palace entrance, and Evelyne had no choice but to follow. Servants bowed as they passed. Guards saluted. Every person they encountered looked at Kaelric with a mix of fear and absolute loyalty. No one looked at Evelyne at all. They climbed stairs and moved through corridors that seemed to go on forever. Everything was stone and ice and cold metal. No warmth, no color, just endless frozen beauty that felt more like a tomb than a palace. Finally, Kaelric stopped in front of a set of carved wooden doors. "Your quarters," he said. "Servants will bring you anything you need, food, clothing, books, whatever you want." Evelyne looked at the doors, then back at him. "And where will you be?" "My chambers are 3 floors up. If you need me, tell the guards. They'll bring me word." "Will I see you again?" Something complicated crossed his face. "Yes, tomorrow. There's a council meeting and I want you there." "Why?" "Because the moment I claimed you in Moonveil, I made you a target. Every noble in my court will be watching to see if you're a weakness they can exploit." His eyes locked onto hers. "So tomorrow, you're going to stand beside me and show them exactly how dangerous it is to underestimate a woman with witch blood." Before Evelyne could respond, Kaelric turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the stone corridor until he disappeared around a corner. Evelyne stood alone in the frozen hallway and felt the weight of what she'd agreed to settle onto her shoulders like chains. She pushed open the doors to her quarters and stepped inside. The room was beautiful. Massive windows overlooking snow-covered mountains, a fireplace carved from black stone, furniture that looked like it had been made for royalty. And on the bed, laid out carefully, was a dress, deep crimson, the color of blood on snow. Evelyne walked over and touched the fabric. Silk, expensive, cut in the northern style with a high collar and long sleeves. There was a note pinned to the bodice in sharp, precise handwriting. "Wear this tomorrow. Show them you're not afraid. No signature." But Evelyne knew who'd left it. She sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the dress for a long time. Then she started laughing. Not because anything was funny, but because somewhere between being rejected in Moonveil and claimed by a dying king, her life had become so absurd that all she could do was laugh or scream. And Evelyne Drakhar had never been much of a screamer. Yet. She woke the next morning to someone pounding on her door. Evelyne bolted upright, heart racing, and grabbed the knife she'd hidden under her pillow the night before. Old habits from living in a kingdom that hated her. "Lady Drakhar." A woman's voice, sharp and impatient. "The king requires your presence in the war room in 1 hour." Evelyne climbed out of bed and opened the door a crack. A middle-aged woman in servant's clothing stood in the hallway, her expression somewhere between annoyance and resignation. "I'm Mira," the woman said flatly, "head of the household staff. I've been assigned to make sure you don't embarrass yourself or the king today." "Good morning to you too." Mira's mouth tightened. "We don't have time for pleasantries. You need to bathe, dress, and be presentable in less than an hour. The council waits for no one, not even the king's new pet." The word pet landed like a slap, but Evelyne kept her expression neutral. "I can dress myself." "Not in northern formal wear, you can't. Now move." The next hour was a blur of hot water, unfamiliar clothing, and Mira's constant stream of instructions delivered in a tone that made it clear she thought Evelyne was an idiot. By the time she was finished, Evelyne barely recognized herself in the mirror. The crimson dress fit perfectly, hugging her body before fleurs soir, flaring slightly at the hips. Her dark hair had been pulled back in an intricate braid that exposed her neck and the small scar beneath her jaw. A gift from a noble boy who'd tried to cut her throat when she was 16 because his mother told him witch daughters needed to be culled young. She'd broken his arm in 3 places before the guards pulled her off him. Mira stepped back and examined her critically. "You'll do. Barely. Try not to speak unless spoken to, and for the God's sake, don't use magic. Half the council would execute you on the spot if they had an excuse." "Noted. And one more thing." Mira's voice dropped lower. "The king hasn't brought a woman to court in 14 years. Every person in that room will be trying to figure out what you are to him. Don't give them ammunition." Evelyne met her eyes in the mirror. "What am I to him?" "I don't know, and that terrifies me." Uchat. The war room was exactly what it sounded like. A massive chamber dominated by a table carved to show a map of the entire Northern Empire. Territories marked in silver. Enemy kingdoms in black. Fortresses, cities, and strategic points indicated with carved stones. Around the table stood 20 men in formal armor and fur cloaks, each one radiating power and barely concealed hostility. They all turned when Evelyne entered. The silence was immediate and absolute. Kaelric stood at the head of the table, dressed in black and silver, his expression unreadable. When he saw her, something flickered in his eyes. Approval, maybe, or satisfaction. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "this is Lady Evelyne Drakhar. She is under my direct protection and will be attending councils from this point forward." A man near the center of the table stepped forward, tall, silver-haired, with a face like a hawk and eyes that missed nothing. "My king, with all respect, this is a war council. Strategic discussions of the Empire's security, not a place for— "For what, Lord Valor?" Kaelric's voice dropped 10 degrees. "Finish that sentence carefully." Valor's jaw tightened, but he bowed his head slightly. "For civilians unfamiliar with military protocol. Lady Drakhar is no ordinary civilian, and her presence here is not optional. It's a command." Another man spoke up, younger, with a scar running from his temple to his jaw. "The council has a right to understand why the king has brought a southern half-blood into our most sensitive discussions." Kaelric's smile was razor-sharp. "You have a right to obey your king, Lord Theron. Nothing more." The temperature in the room dropped. Frost began forming on the edges of the table. Evelyne felt every eye on her, measuring her, judging her, already deciding she was weak, unworthy, a distraction at best, a spy at worst. She'd spent her entire life being looked at like that, and she was done with it. Evelyne walked forward slowly, her heels clicking on the stone floor, until she stood directly across from Lord Valor. She met his eyes and held them. "I didn't ask to be here," she said clearly. "I didn't ask for the king's protection or his attention, but I accepted both because I understand what happens to women who refuse powerful men. So if my presence offends you, Lord Valor, I suggest you take it up with your king, because I'm not going anywhere." Silence. Then Valor's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile if it held any warmth. "Well, at least she has a spine." "More than that," Kaelric said softly, and the pride in his voice was unmistakable. "She has fire." He gestured to an empty chair beside his own at the head of the table. "Sit, Evelyne." She sat, and for the next 2 hours, Evelyne listened as the council discussed troop movements, border disputes, supply lines, and political marriages. She didn't speak, didn't react, just absorbed everything like she was studying for a test she couldn't afford to fail, because that's exactly what this was, a test. And Evelyne Drakhar had spent her whole life passing tests designed to destroy her. The meeting finally ended as the sun began to set. Nobles filed out in groups, their conversations hushed and tense. A few glanced back at Evelyne as they left, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright contempt. Lord Valor was the last to leave. He paused at the door and looked back at Kaelric. "A word, my king, privately." Kaelric glanced at Evelyne. "Wait for me in the hallway." She stood and left without argument, though every instinct screamed at her to stay and listen. The heavy doors closed behind her, muffling the voices inside to indistinct murmurs. Evelyne pressed her back against the cold stone wall and tried to steady her breathing. She'd survived, barely. But the way those men had looked at her, like she was a disease infecting their perfect kingdom, made her skin crawl. The door opened 10 minutes later and Vialor emerged. He stopped when he saw her, his hawk-like eyes studying her with clinical precision. "You handled yourself well in there," he said quietly. "Better than I expected." "Should I be flattered?" "No, you should be careful." He stepped closer, and Evelyne forced herself not to retreat. "The king is dying, girl. Everyone in this palace knows it, and when he finally falls, there will be a power vacuum that will tear this empire apart. Whoever stands closest to him when that happens will either rise to unimaginable heights or fall into a very deep grave." "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning from someone who's been playing this game longer than you've been alive." Valor's voice dropped. "Whatever the king sees in you, it won't be enough to save you when the ice finally takes him. So my advice? Leave, now, while you still can." He walked away before Evelyne could respond, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. She stood there, heart pounding, until Kaelric appeared in the doorway. "What did he say to you?" "He told me to leave." Kaelric's expression darkened. And I'm still here." Something fierce and hungry flashed across his face. He reached out and caught her wrist, his touch cold even through the glove. "Come with me. There's something you need to see." He pulled her through the palace, moving fast, until they reached a section she hadn't seen before. Older. Colder. The walls here were pure ice, carved with symbols that made Evelyne's skin prickle. Kaelric stopped in front of a massive door sealed with iron chains. "This," he said quietly, "is where it started. 300 years ago." He pulled off his glove, and Evelyne watched in horror as frost spread from his hand to the chains. They shattered like glass, and the door swung open on its own. Inside was a tomb. A woman's body lay on a stone slab, perfectly preserved in ice. She was beautiful. Dark hair, pale skin, and around her throat was a burn mark in the shape of a crown. "Queen Morwenna," Kaelric said, "the witch queen who cursed my bloodline. She loved a king who betrayed her, killed her, and with her dying breath, she made sure every king who came after would suffer the same fate. Frozen. Alone. Dying slowly while the world moved on." Evelyne stared at the woman's frozen face and felt something twist in her chest. "Why show me this?" Kaelric looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something raw and desperate in his eyes. "Because the moment you walked into that hall in Moonveil, I felt warmth for the first time in years. And when I stood near you today, the ice receded even more." He took her hand and pressed it against his chest, right over his heart. "Feel that?" Evelyne did. A heartbeat, slow but steady, warm beneath the armor. "That's impossible," she whispered. "No," Kaelric said softly. "That's you." And before Evelyne could pull away, before she could think or breathe or process what was happening, the ice around Queen Morwenna's body cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but enough to prove that something ancient and terrible had just woken up. The crack in the ice spread slowly, a spiderweb of fractures crawling across Queen Morwenna's frozen tomb like living veins. The sound was wrong, not breaking glass or splitting stone, but something organic. Wet, like bone separating from frozen flesh. Evelyne jerked her hand back from Kaelric's chest, but his fingers closed around her wrist, holding her in place. His grip was iron cold and desperate. "Don't move," he said quietly. "The ice is breaking." "I know." The temperature in the tomb plummeted another 10 degrees. Evelyne's breath came out in white clouds, and she felt frost forming on her eyelashes. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get as far from this room as possible before whatever was trapped in that ice woke up completely. But Kaelric held her there, his eyes fixed on the frozen queen's face. 300 years, he said softly. 300 years, and nothing has disturbed this tomb. Not fire, not magic, not the most powerful sorcerers in 6 kingdoms trying to break the curse. He turned his head and looked at Evelyne with an intensity that made her stomach drop. And then you walk into this room, and the ice cracks. That doesn't mean anything. It means everything. The fracture reached the edge of the stone slab and stopped. Just stopped, like it had hit some invisible barrier. The silence that followed was worse than the cracking. Kaelric released Evelyne's wrist and stepped back, his movements controlled but his breathing uneven. She could see the frost spreading up his neck now, gray veins creeping toward his jaw. "We need to leave," she said. "Yes." He turned and walked out of the tomb without looking back. Evelyne followed, and the moment they crossed the threshold, the massive iron door slammed shut on its own. The chains reformed, sealing the room again. Evelyne leaned against the wall and tried to steady her breathing. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, though the tomb had been freezing, from something else, something that felt like recognition buried so deep she couldn't name it. Kaelric stood a few feet away, one hand braced against the ice wall, his head bowed. When he spoke, his voice was raw. "I need you to stay close to me, not just in the palace, close, within sight, because whatever just happened in there, it's connected to you. And if the curse is reacting to your presence, then you're either my salvation or my destruction." "Which do you think I am?" He lifted his head and met her eyes. "I think you're the first real chance I've had at survival in 14 years, and I will do whatever it takes to keep you alive and near me until I understand what you are." The possessive certainty in his words should have terrified her. Instead, Evelyne felt something dark and familiar settle in her chest. She'd spent her whole life being treated like a curse, like something dangerous that needed to be contained or destroyed. And here was a man who looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking since before she was born. It felt almost like power. "What if I don't want to be your cure?" she asked. Kaelric's smile was all edges. "Then I'll convince you, one way or another. Boshamatik." The palace servants woke her before dawn the next morning with news that the king required her presence at breakfast. Not requested. Required. Evelyne dressed quickly in the clothes Mira had left for her, dark green wool that was warmer than anything she'd owned in Moonveil, and followed the guard through corridors that looked different in the pre-dawn darkness. They led her to a private dining room overlooking the eastern mountains. Kaelric sat at a table laden with food, most of which looked like it hadn't been touched. He glanced up when she entered, and she saw the exhaustion carved into his face. He hadn't slept. "Sit," he said. Evelyne sat across from him and studied the spread. Bread, meat, cheese, fruit preserved in honey. Enough food to feed 10 people. She picked up a piece of bread and tore it in half. "You look like hell," she said bluntly. "I feel worse." "The curse?" "Getting stronger, faster than before." He held up his hand, and Evelyne's stomach turned. The gray had spread past his wrist now, creeping up his forearm in jagged patterns that looked like frozen lightning. "I have healers who slow it down, potions that buy me hours at a time, but it's a losing battle. And you think I can change that? I know you can. The question is how?" He leaned back in his chair and watched her with those cold, calculating eyes. "Tell me about your mother." Evelyne's hand tightened on the bread. "Why?" "Because she was executed for treason and forbidden magic. And because I've spent the last 14 years researching every curse, every spell, every piece of dark magic connected to my bloodline. Your mother's name appeared in records I found 3 years ago." The room tilted slightly. Evelyne set down the bread carefully. "What records?" "Documents from the original witch trials, the ones that happened right after Queen Morwenna cursed my family." Kaelric reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age. He slid it across the table. "Read it." Evelyne unfolded the parchment with shaking hands. The writing was old, cramped, barely legible, but she could make out enough. "Seraphine of House Drakhar, daughter of the fallen line, keeper of the flame that burns eternal. She walks between ice and fire, bearing the mark of queens long dead." Her vision blurred. She read the passage again, then a third time, trying to make sense of words that felt like they'd been written specifically to destroy her. "What does this mean?" she asked. "It means your mother wasn't just a witch. She was a descendant of Queen Morwenna's bloodline, the same queen who cursed my family." Kaelric's voice was quiet, but absolute. "You're not just connected to the curse, Evelyne. You're part of it, Your blood carries the same magic that's been killing my family for 3 centuries. The bread turned to ash in her mouth. She swallowed hard and forced herself to keep breathing. In, out, in, out. That's impossible. My mother never told me. Your mother died protecting a secret that would have gotten you executed the moment anyone discovered it. Think about it. Why else would they kill her for treason? What did she do that was so dangerous they had to burn her publicly? Evelyne's mind raced back to the trial. The accusations. Forbidden magic. Consorting with enemies of the crown. Attempting to overthrow the rightful order. At the time, she'd thought it was all lies. Political maneuvering by families who wanted House Drakhar destroyed. But what if it wasn't lies? What if her mother had been trying to do something and they'd killed her before she could finish? What did my mother want? Evelyne asked quietly. Kaelric stood and walked to the window, his back to her. According to the records I found, she was searching for a way to break the curse. Not for my sake. For yours. Because she knew that eventually someone would connect your bloodline to Morwenna, and when they did, you'd be executed just like every other witch descendant over the last 300 years. So she tried to fix it, and they killed her for it. Evelyne closed her eyes and felt something inside her crack wide open. All those years, she'd thought her mother died because of politics, because she'd made enemies, because she'd been careless. But the truth was so much worse. Her mother had died trying to save her from a curse Evelyne hadn't even known existed. "Why didn't you tell me this yesterday?" she asked. Kaelric turned back to face her. "Because I needed to see how you reacted to the tomb first. If the ice cracked when you were near it, then the theory I've been working on for 3 years is correct. You're not just connected to the curse, you're the key to breaking it." "How?" "I don't know yet, but I will figure it out. And when I do, we're both going to survive this." The certainty in his voice was absolute, unshakable, like he'd already decided the outcome and reality just needed to catch up. Evelyne stood slowly, her legs unsteady. "And if I can't break the curse, what happens to me then?" Kaelric crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and caught her face in both hands, tilting her head up to meet his eyes. The cold of his skin burned against hers, but she didn't pull away. "Then we die together," he said simply. "Because if the curse takes me, it will come for you next. Your bloodline makes you a target. The only reason you're still alive is because no one else has connected the dots yet. But they will. And when they do, you'll need me as much as I need you." It was the truth. Brutal and inescapable. Evelyne had spent her whole life running from a legacy she didn't understand, and now it had finally caught up to her in the form of a dying king and a 300-year-old curse. She pulled back from Kaelric's grip and wrapped her arms around herself. "So what now? Now you stay close to me. We attend councils. We let the court see that you're under my protection. And in private, we figure out how your magic works and what it can do to the curse." He paused. "Can you access your power?" "I don't know. My mother never taught me. She said it was safer if I didn't know how." "We'll figure it out together then. And if my magic makes things worse," Kaelric's smile was sharp and cold, "then at least we'll go down fighting." The next 3 days passed in a blur of council meetings, cold stares from nobles who barely hid their contempt, and long hours in the palace library where Kaelric pulled book after book on ancient magic and bloodline curses. Evelyne absorbed as much as she could, but the texts were dense, written in languages she barely understood, full of references to rituals and power she'd never seen. At night, she dreamed of fire, not the gentle warmth of a hearth, but infernos that consumed everything they touched. In the dreams, she stood in the center of the flames, untouched, while everything around her burned to ash. And always, just at the edge of the fire, she saw a woman's face. Dark hair, pale skin, eyes like midnight. Queen Morwenna, watching her burn. She woke on the 4th morning to find Mira standing beside her bed, her expression grim. "The king wants you in the throne room, now." Evelyne dressed quickly and followed Mira through the palace. The corridors were more crowded than usual, servants rushing past with armfuls of supplies, guards moving in tight formations. Something was wrong. The throne room doors stood open, and inside chaos. 50 nobles packed the space, their voices rising in heated argument. At the center of it all sat Kaelric on a throne carved from black ice, his expression carved from the same material. Lord Vaelor stood at his right hand, and when Evelyne entered, every head in the room turned toward her. The silence was immediate and suffocating. Kaelric's eyes found hers across the distance. "Come here, Evelyne." She walked through the crowd, feeling every gaze on her like a physical weight. When she reached the throne, Kaelric gestured to a smaller chair beside his own. An honor seat, reserved for queens and consorts. Evelyne hesitated. "Sit," Kaelric said quietly, and it wasn't a request. She sat. Lord Vaelor stepped forward, his hawk-like face tight with barely controlled anger. "My king, with respect, this is a matter of state security. Lady Drakhar has no place in this discussion." "Lady Drakhar has every place in this discussion, considering she's the reason we're having it." Evelyne's stomach dropped. "What happened?" A younger noble pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with anger and fear. Lord Theron, the one with the scar she'd seen at the first council meeting. He pointed an accusing finger at Evelyne. 3 villages on the southern border reported fires last night. Unnatural fires that consumed everything they touched. Witnesses claim they saw a woman's face in the flames, dark hair, pale skin. They're calling it the Witch Queen's return. The room erupted into shouting. Evelyne felt the blood drain from her face, the dreams, the fires, the woman watching her burn. It couldn't be coincidence. Kaelric's hand slammed down on the arm of his throne, and frost exploded outward across the floor. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in seconds, and every person in that room froze mid-breath. "Silence," he said quietly, and the word cut through the chaos like a blade. The shouting stopped. Kaelric stood, and even with the curse eating him alive, he radiated absolute authority. "The fires on the southern border are being investigated. Until we have confirmed reports, no one accuses anyone of anything. Understood?" Theron's jaw worked, but he nodded. "Yes, my king." "Good. Now get out. All of you." The nobles filed out quickly, shooting poisonous looks at Evelyne as they passed. Lord Vaelor lingered near the door. "My king, if the Witch Queen's magic is awakening, then we deal with it, like we deal with everything else. Leave, Vaelor." The older man bowed stiffly and left. The moment the doors closed, Kaelric turned to Evelyne. "Tell me about the dreams." She flinched. "How did you know?" "Because I've been watching you for 3 nights now, and every time you sleep, frost forms on the walls of your chamber. And last night, I felt heat." He crossed to her and pulled her to her feet. "What do you see in the dreams?" "Fire. Everywhere. And a woman watching me. Dark hair. Pale skin." "Morwenna." "I don't know. Maybe." Evelyne's hands were shaking. "Kaelric, what if I'm doing this? What if my magic is causing the fires? Then we learn to control it before it destroys everything. And if I can't?" His hands tightened on her shoulders. "You will, because the alternative is unacceptable." The doors burst open. A guard stumbled in, his armor scorched, his face covered in soot. "My king, another fire. In the eastern quarter. It started in the barracks and spread to the armory. We've lost 20 soldiers." Kaelric's expression went blank. Empty. The mask of a king who'd seen too much death to react anymore. "Evacuate the quarter. Seal the gates. No one in or out until the fires are controlled." The guard saluted and ran. Evelyne stared at Kaelric's face and saw the exact moment the humanity drained out of him. The warmth she'd felt over the last few days vanished, replaced by ice so cold it hurt to stand near him. "Kaelric," she said quietly. He didn't respond, didn't even look at her, just stared at the doors where the guard had disappeared. She reached out and touched his hand. The ice receded instantly. Color flooded back into his face, and he gasped like he'd been drowning. His fingers closed around hers, crushing, desperate. "Don't let go," he said roughly. "I won't." They stood there in the empty throne room, connected by touch and desperation, and a curse neither of them fully understood. And Evelyne realized with brutal clarity that she'd passed the point of no return. She couldn't leave now, even if she wanted to, because the moment she walked away, Kaelric would lose himself to the ice completely. And when he fell, the Empire would burn. Maybe from the fires spreading across the southern border, maybe from the chaos of a kingdom without a king, or maybe from whatever dark magic was waking up inside her, demanding to be acknowledged. They moved Evelyne's quarters that night, not to a guest chamber on the lower floors, but to rooms directly adjacent to Kaelric's own. A suite of connected spaces with a private door between them that could be locked from either side but never was. Mira supervised the servants moving Evelyne's belongings, her expression tight with disapproval. "The court will talk," she said flatly. "Let them," Evelyne replied. "You don't understand what you're doing. A woman living in the king's chambers without a marriage bond is necessary. He needs me close. You saw what happened in the throne room." Mira's mouth pressed into a thin line. "I saw the king nearly lose himself to the curse, and I saw you pull him back. Which means you have power over him now, girl, and power in this palace is more dangerous than any curse." She left before Evelyne could respond. The new quarters were beautiful, larger than her previous room, with windows overlooking the northern mountains and a fireplace that actually worked. But the luxury didn't matter. What mattered was the door connecting her space to Kaelric's. She could hear him moving on the other side. Footsteps, the sound of armor being removed, then silence. Evelyne walked to the door and pressed her palm against the wood. On the other side, she heard Kaelric's voice, quiet and strained. "I can feel you standing there. Can I come in?" A pause. Then, "Yes." She pushed open the door and stepped into his chamber. It was sparse. A bed that looked like it hadn't been slept in properly in years. A desk covered in maps and documents, weapons mounted on the walls. And in the center of the room, Kaelric stood shirtless, his back to her. Evelyne's breath caught. The gray had spread across his entire torso now, creeping up his spine in jagged patterns that looked like frozen rivers. His skin was more ice than flesh, and she could see frost forming with each breath he took. "It's worse," she said quietly. "Yes." "How long?" "Days, maybe a week if I'm lucky." He turned to face her, and the exhaustion in his eyes was devastating. "I'm running out of time, Evelyne, and I need to know if you can save me before I lose myself completely." She crossed the room slowly, watching the way his body tensed as she approached. Not from fear, from something else. Something hungry and desperate and barely controlled. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "Touch me, like you did in the throne room. Let me feel warmth again." Evelyne reached out and placed her hand over his heart. The effect was immediate. Heat flooded through her palm, racing up her arm and settling in her chest like a second heartbeat. The gray on Kaelric's skin receded, pulling back from the point of contact in slow, reluctant waves. Color returned to his face, his breathing steadied, and his eyes, those frozen lake eyes, thawed just enough to show something raw and human underneath. "How do you do that?" he asked roughly. "I don't know. I just feel it. Like there's fire inside me that wants to burn the ice away." His hand covered hers, pressing it harder against his chest. "Then burn it. All of it. I don't care if it kills me. I'd rather die warm than live frozen." "It won't kill you." "You can't know that." "Yes, I can." Evelyne met his eyes and felt something ancient stir in her blood. Recognition, purpose, power she'd spent her whole life suppressing because her mother told her it was safer to stay small. Because the fire doesn't want to destroy you, it wants to save you. Kaelric's grip tightened on her hand. "And what do you want, Evelynis?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them was ready to name. What did she want? Survival, safety, revenge against everyone who'd ever called her unworthy, a place in the world where she didn't have to apologize for existing. And maybe, buried underneath all of that, she wanted to be seen, really seen, not as a curse or a tool or a half-blood mistake, but as something powerful and necessary and vital. Kaelric saw her that way, and that was more dangerous than any curse. "I want to understand what I am," she said finally, "and I want to survive long enough to make everyone who tried to destroy me regret it." His smile was sharp and approving. "Good. Then we're on the same side." "Are we?" "We are now." He pulled her hand away from his chest slowly, and the moment the contact broke, the gray began creeping back. Slower than before, but inevitable. Evelyne watched it spread and felt something fierce and possessive rise in her throat. This man, this brutal, frozen king, needed her, and for the first time in her life, being needed felt like power, instead of burden. "I should go," she said. "Stay." The single word stopped her cold. Kaelric's expression was carefully neutral, but his voice carried an edge of desperation he couldn't quite hide. "Why?" she asked. "Because when you leave, the ice comes back faster, and I'm tired of fighting it alone." Evelyne knew she should refuse, should walk back through that connecting door and put distance between herself and this man who was becoming more essential to her survival every day. But survival wasn't just about staying alive anymore. It was about claiming the power she'd been denied her whole life. And Kaelric Thornvale, Alpha King of the Northern Empire, was offering her exactly that. "Where do you want me?" she asked. He gestured to a chair near the fireplace. "Just sit. Be close. That's enough." She sat. Kaelric returned to his desk and began reviewing documents, his movements methodical and controlled. But Evelyne could see the way his shoulders relaxed, the way the frost on his skin receded inch by inch, the way he breathed easier just from her presence in the same room. They stayed like that for hours, silent, connected by proximity and necessity, and something neither of them was ready to name. And outside, beyond the palace walls, fires continued to burn across the southern border. Unnatural fires that consumed everything they touched. Fires that whispered a name Evelyne was only beginning to understand. Morwenna. The Witch Queen was waking up, and she was calling her descendant home. Batu. The next morning brought news that shattered whatever fragile peace Evelyne had found. Lord Vialor appeared at breakfast with 3 soldiers and an expression carved from stone. He bowed to Kaelric but didn't acknowledge Evelyne at all. "My king, we've identified the source of the fires." Kaelric set down his cup slowly. "Explain." Vialor pulled a scorched piece of fabric from his coat and laid it on the table. Evelyne's stomach dropped. She recognized it immediately. Dark green wool, the same fabric as the dress she'd been wearing 3 days ago. This was found at the center of the first fire. Witnesses reported seeing a woman matching Lady Drakhar's description walking through the flames moments before the blaze started. The temperature in the room plummeted. Kaelric's voice was deadly quiet. "You're accusing her." "I'm presenting evidence, my king. What you choose to do with it is your decision." "The evidence is a piece of cloth that could have come from anywhere." "There are also these." Valor gestured to the soldiers, who stepped forward and laid 3 more items on the table. A charred hairpin, a fragment of parchment with Evelyne's handwriting, and most damning of all, a witness testimony signed by 5 separate villagers claiming they saw Lady Evelyne Drakhar standing in the center of the flames, her eyes glowing like embers. Evelyne felt the walls closing in. "I was here in the palace. I haven't left these grounds since I arrived." "Can anyone confirm that?" Valor asked mildly. "I can," Kaelric said, his voice like breaking ice. "She's been within my sight for days." "With respect, my king, you cannot be her alibi and her protector. The law requires independent verification. The law requires evidence that isn't fabricated by ambitious lords looking to undermine my authority." Vialor's expression didn't change, but something dark flickered in his eyes. "My king, I understand your attachment to Lady Drakhar, but if she is the source of these fires, then keeping her close puts the entire empire at risk. The council is demanding she be detained until a proper investigation can be conducted." "The council can go to hell." "The council speaks for the empire, and the empire is afraid." Kaelric stood and the frost exploded outward from his body like a shockwave. Every surface in the room crystallized with ice. The windows frosted over. The food on the table turned to frozen blocks. "Get out," he said quietly. Valor held his ground. "My king, get out before I freeze you where you stand and mount your corpse on the palace gates as a reminder of what happens to traitors." The soldiers backed away immediately. Valor stared at Kaelric for a long moment, then bowed stiffly and left. The moment the door closed, Kaelric collapsed against the table, his breathing ragged. The ice receded slowly, pulled back by sheer force of will. Evelyne stood and crossed to him. "Kaelric, don't." He held up a hand, stopping her. "Don't tell me it's fine. Don't tell me we'll figure it out. Because right now, my entire court thinks you're burning my empire to the ground, and I just threatened to execute my chief advisor for presenting evidence against you. The evidence is fake. Someone planted it. I know. But proving that is going to be nearly impossible if the council has already decided you're guilty. He straightened and met her eyes, and the desperation there was stark. I can protect you from accusations. I can shield you from political maneuvering. But if the fires continue and people keep dying, eventually even my authority won't be enough to save you. Then we stop the fires. How? We don't even know what's causing them. Evelyne thought about the dreams. The woman's face in the flames. The heat building inside her chest every time Kaelric touched her. The way Queen Morwenna's tomb had cracked the moment she stepped inside. I think I do, she said quietly. I think the fires are connected to me. Not because I'm starting them deliberately, but because my magic is waking up, and it doesn't know how to control itself yet. Kaelric stared at her. You're saying you're burning villages in your sleep. I'm saying my power is leaking out and it's manifesting as fire because that's what runs in my bloodline. Morwenna's magic, my mother's magic. All of it has been suppressed for years and now it's breaking free. Then we need to find a way to control it before it destroys everything. And how do we do that when I don't even know how to access my magic deliberately? Kaelric was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked to his desk and pulled out a locked drawer. Inside was a small wooden box, ancient and carved with symbols that made Evelyne's skin crawl. This, he said, belonged to Queen Morwenna. I found it in the palace archives 10 years ago. Inside is a journal, written in her own hand, detailing every spell, every ritual, every piece of magic she used before and after the curse. He opened the box carefully and pulled out a leather-bound book. The pages were yellowed and fragile, covered in cramped handwriting that seemed to shift and move in the light. If your magic is the same as hers, then maybe her journal can teach you how to control it. Evelyne took the book with shaking hands. The moment her fingers touched the leather, heat flooded through her. Not painful, not even uncomfortable, just warm, familiar, like coming home after a long absence. The pages opened on their own, flipping rapidly until they stopped on a passage written in dark red ink. To the daughter of my blood who reads these words, you are not cursed, you are the cure. The kings who killed me will die frozen and alone, but you will bring the fire that burns their ice away. Do not fear your power. Embrace it, feed it, let it consume everything that tried to destroy you. Only then will you understand what you truly are. Evelyne read the passage 3 times, her heart pounding. What does it say? Kaelric asked. She looked up at him, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something close to clarity. It says I'm the answer. Not just to breaking your curse, but to ending the cycle that's been killing your family for 300 years. She closed the journal carefully. But to do that, I have to stop running from what I am. I have to accept the fire. All of it, even if it destroys me. Kaelric's expression was unreadable. And if it destroys you, it destroys me too. Yes. Then we do this together. He held out his hand. Evelyne stared at it for a long moment. Taking his hand meant committing fully to this path, meant accepting that she was no longer just Evelyne Drakhar, the rejected half-blood daughter trying to survive. She was something older, something dangerous, something powerful enough to break a 300-year-old curse or burn an empire to ash in the attempt. She took his hand. The moment their skin touched, fire and ice collided. Heat exploded through Evelyne's body, racing down her spine and settling in her chest like a living thing. Kaelric gasped, and the gray on his skin receded completely, replaced by warmth and color and life. For 5 perfect seconds, he was whole. Then the palace shook. Not an earthquake. Something worse. A pulse of pure magical energy that rippled outward from the throne room where Queen Morwenna's tomb was sealed. The walls cracked, windows shattered, and deep beneath the palace, something ancient and terrible woke up fully. Kaelric pulled Evelyne close, his arms wrapped around her protectively as debris rained down around them. What was that? She gasped. The curse. Fighting back. Against what? He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes, and what she saw there was equal parts terror and hope. Against you. The palace stopped shaking, but the silence that followed was worse than the tremors. Evelyne pulled back from Kaelric's protective embrace and stared at the cracks spiderwebbing across the marble floor. They weren't random. They formed patterns, symbols, the same ones carved into Queen Morwenna's tomb. Kaelric's breathing was ragged, The warmth that had flooded his skin moments ago was already fading, the gray creeping back with renewed hunger. He released Evelyne and stumbled backward, one hand braced against the wall. The door burst open. Guards flooded in, weapons drawn, eyes wild with panic. Behind them came Lord Vaelor, his expression carefully neutral, despite the chaos. "My king, the throne room," one guard gasped. "The seal, it's breaking." Kaelric's face went blank, empty. The mask of a king who'd learned to bury terror under layers of ice. "How many guards at the tomb?" 20, my lord, but the temperature down there, it's dropping fast. 2 men already collapsed from exposure. "Pull them back, seal the corridor. No one goes near that room until I give the order." The guard saluted and ran. Vaelor remained, his hawk-like eyes moving between Kaelric and Evelyne with clinical assessment. "The council is convening in the war room," he said quietly. "They're demanding answers, and Lady Drakhar's immediate detention." Kaelric's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "Tell the council I'll attend when I'm ready, and tell them that anyone who touches Evelyne answers to me personally." "My king, with all respect, your personal feelings cannot—" "Get out, Vaelor." The older man's jaw tightened, but he bowed and left without another word. The moment they were alone, Kaelric turned to Evelyne. The exhaustion in his eyes had deepened into something darker. Desperation wrapped in failing control. "The curse is accelerating," he said. "Every time you touch me, it recedes. But the moment you stop, it comes back twice as strong. Like it's punishing me for finding relief." Evelyne's stomach twisted. "Then we need to figure out how to break it completely, not just treat the symptoms. And how do we do that when every attempt to access your power causes destruction? We practice. Somewhere isolated where I can't hurt anyone." "There is no isolated place in this palace. Every room, every corridor, every inch of this empire is watched." He ran a hand through his hair, and Evelyne saw frost forming on his fingertips. "We're running out of time. The council wants you detained. The fires are spreading, and the curse is killing me faster every day." "So what do we do?" Kaelric met her eyes, and what she saw there made her blood run cold. Not the warmth of the man who'd claimed her in Moonveil. Not the desperate king who needed her to survive. Something older, harder. A predator calculating survival odds and not liking the numbers. "We give the council something to focus on besides you," he said slowly. "A target they can blame. Someone whose execution will satisfy their need for justice." "Who?" His smile was razor-sharp and completely empty. "Whoever planted that evidence against you. We find them. We expose them. And we make an example that reminds everyone what happens when they try to undermine my authority." Evelyne stared at him and felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't the man who'd defended her in the throne room. This was the Alpha King who'd crushed 3 rebellions before turning 25. The ruler who executed enemies so thoroughly their families forgot they existed. This was survival without sentiment, and it terrified her how much sense it made. "How do we find who planted the evidence?" she asked. "We start with who had access to your quarters, who knew your movements, who benefits most from your destruction." He straightened, and despite the gray consuming his body, authority radiated from him like heat. "Get dressed. Something that shows you're not afraid. We're attending that council meeting, and we're going on the offensive." The war room was packed when they arrived. Every noble who held any power in the Northern Empire stood around that massive carved table, their faces ranging from hostile to openly contemptuous. Lord Theron, Lady Ashlyn of House Corvain, Duke Martin, Lord Pharos. And at the far end, standing alone with the confidence of a man who knew exactly where the power lay, Lord Vaelor. Evelyne wore the crimson dress Kaelric had left for her that first night. Blood on snow. A declaration that she refused to play victim. Her hair was pulled back in a severe braid that exposed her throat and the scar beneath her jaw. Every weakness on display, every vulnerability transformed into armor through sheer defiance. She walked beside Kaelric, matching his stride, and the room fell silent. Kaelric didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, one hand resting on the hilt of his sword, the other braced against the carved map. "You called this meeting?" he said quietly. "So talk." Lord Theron stepped forward, his scarred face tight with barely controlled anger. "My king, the fires have consumed 12 villages now, hundreds dead, thousands displaced. And every witness report points to the same source, Lady Drakhar. Witness reports can be bought, fabricated, coerced, not when they come from 5 separate villages across 3 territories, not when they all describe the same woman. Dark hair, pale skin, standing in the center of flames that burn everything except her. Kaelric's expression didn't change, but Evelyne felt the temperature drop. And you believe Lady Drakhar has been traveling to these villages undetected, setting fires, and returning to the palace without anyone noticing. I believe she doesn't need to travel anywhere. I believe her magic is the source, whether she controls it or not. The statement hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Evelyne spoke for the first time, her voice clear and cold. If my magic is destroying villages without my knowledge or consent, then locking me in a cell won't stop it. It'll just give you a convenient scapegoat when the fires continue. Lady Evelyne, a sharp-featured woman with silver streaking her dark hair, leaned forward. Then what do you suggest, girl? That we simply allow you to remain free while our people burn? I suggest you find the real source of the fires, instead of wasting time on convenient targets. The real source is standing right in front of us. Prove it. The challenge landed like a thrown gauntlet. Lady Evelyne's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, Duke Martin spoke up. He was older than most of the council, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too many wars. There is a way to prove it, he said slowly. An old test, used during the original witch trials 3 centuries ago. If Lady Drakhar truly carries Morwenna's bloodline, her magic will respond to direct confrontation with the curse. Kaelric's hand tightened on his sword. What kind of test? Bring her to the tomb. Place her inside with the queen's body. If she's connected to the curse, the ice will react. If she's not, nothing happens. And if the ice does react, then we have confirmation that Lady Drakhar's magic is linked to the fires, and the council can make an informed decision about how to proceed. Evelyne felt her pulse hammering against her ribs. The tomb. The same place where the ice had cracked just from her presence. If they put her inside, surrounded by Morwenna's frozen body and 3 centuries of accumulated curse magic, there was no telling what would happen. But refusing would look like guilt. She met Kaelric's eyes and saw her own trapped desperation reflected back. They'd been backed into a corner, and the only way out was through. I'll do it, she said quietly. The room erupted, voices overlapping, some demanding she be restrained first, others insisting the test was too dangerous, a few calling for her immediate execution to be safe. Kaelric's voice cut through the chaos like breaking ice. The test will be conducted, under controlled conditions, with guards present. And if anyone attempts to harm Lady Drakhar during or after, I will personally ensure their bloodline ends with them. Lord Vaelor, who'd been silent until now, finally spoke. My king, with respect, your attachment to this woman is clouding your judgment. The Empire's safety must come before personal feelings. My judgment is the only thing keeping this empire from tearing itself apart. Question it again, and you'll find yourself stripped of title and lands before sunset. Vaelor's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. As you command, my king. Kaelric turned to Duke Martin. Prepare the tomb. We conduct the test in 2 hours. And make sure every member of this council is present. I want witnesses to whatever happens down there. The nobles began filing out, their conversations hushed and tense. Evelyne watched them go and felt the weight of what she'd agreed to settle over her like a burial shroud. When the room was empty except for her and Kaelric, he crossed to her and caught her face in both hands. The cold of his skin burned, but she didn't pull away. You didn't have to agree to this, he said roughly. Yes, I did. Refusing would have made me look guilty. And if the test proves you're connected to the fires, then we deal with it. Together. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, and for just a moment, warmth flooded his touch. I won't let them execute you, no matter what that tomb reveals. Even if it means going to war with your own council? Especially then. The certainty in his voice should have been comforting. Instead, it made Evelyne's chest tighten with something close to fear. Not of him, but of what he was willing to destroy to keep her alive. Power built on that kind of desperation didn't last. It consumed everything in its path until nothing remained but ash. Timtadma. They descended to the tomb 2 hours later with an escort of 20 guards and every member of the council. The corridors leading to Morwenna's resting place were colder than Evelyne remembered, frost coating the walls in intricate patterns that looked almost deliberate. Like the curse itself was decorating for a guest it had been waiting centuries to meet. The iron chains sealing the door had been removed. The massive entrance stood open, revealing darkness that seemed to swallow light. Duke Martin carried a lantern that barely penetrated the gloom. "The test is simple," he said, his voice echoing off the ice walls. "Lady Drakhar enters alone, remains inside for 10 minutes. If she emerges unchanged and the tomb remains sealed, she's innocent. If the ice reacts, we have our answer." Lord Theron crossed his arms. "And if she doesn't emerge at all? Then the curse has claimed her, and we seal the tomb permanently." Evelyne's hands were steady at her sides, but her heart hammered against her ribs hard enough to bruise. She looked at Kaelric, who stood rigid and silent, the gray consuming half his face now. He'd deteriorated rapidly over the last 2 hours, the curse fighting him with renewed violence. "He needs me to survive this," she thought, "and I need him to stay strong enough to pull me out if everything goes wrong." She stepped toward the entrance. Kaelric's hand shot out and caught her wrist. "Wait!" He pulled her close enough that she could feel the frost radiating from his body, and pressed something cold and metallic into her palm. A small dagger, plain and unadorned except for symbols carved into the blade. "Iron and silver," he whispered. "The only metals that can cut through curse magic. If something in there tries to hold you, use this." Evelyne closed her fingers around the blade. "And if cutting doesn't work? Then scream. I'll come for you. Council be damned." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him not to throw away his empire for a woman he'd known less than 2 weeks. But the words died in her throat because she could see the truth carved into every line of his face. He wasn't making a rational decision. He was making the only choice that kept him human, and that scared her more than the tomb. Evelyne pulled away from his grip and walked through the entrance before she could change her mind. The darkness swallowed her whole. The temperature dropped so fast her lungs seized. She gasped and tasted ice crystals on her tongue. Behind her, she heard the massive door grinding shut, sealing her inside with 300 years of accumulated hatred. The tomb was exactly as she remembered. Stone slab in the center. Queen Morwenna's body, frozen in ice, perfectly preserved, her face turned toward the entrance like she'd been waiting for someone specific. Evelyne took 3 steps forward, and the ice beneath her feet cracked. Not a small fracture. A massive split that ran from wall to wall, deep enough that she could hear water moving underneath. Ancient water, melting after centuries of stasis. She froze mid-step. The cracks spread. Faster now. Racing up the walls and across the ceiling in patterns that looked deliberate, intentional, like something was carving a message into the ice itself. Then the whispers started, not from outside, from inside her own head. A woman's voice, ancient and cold and furious beyond measure. "Daughter of my blood, you came. Finally. After all these years of waiting, of watching lesser creatures destroy themselves trying to break what I built, you came." Evelyne's hand tightened on the dagger. "Who are you?" The voice laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. "I am the beginning and the end, the queen they murdered and the curse that avenged me. I am Morwenna, and you are mine." The ice around the stone slab shattered. Queen Morwenna's body sat up. Evelyne stumbled backward, her scream caught in her throat. This wasn't possible. The woman had been dead for 3 centuries, frozen, preserved but lifeless. Except she was moving. Morwenna turned her head slowly, and her eyes opened, not pale or faded, burning, actual flames where her pupils should have been. When she spoke, her lips didn't move, but the voice filled the tomb like thunder. "They killed me because I loved a king who was too weak to choose me over his throne. Burned me. Scattered my ashes. Thought that would be the end. But love doesn't die that easily, child. It transforms, becomes something else. Something that endures long after the people who destroyed it are dust." Evelyne forced herself to speak through chattering teeth. "You cursed his bloodline, killed every king who came after him." "Yes. Because if I could not have love, then neither would they. Every king of House Thornvale would know my suffering, would feel their hearts freeze until nothing remained but ice and instinct and slow, inevitable death. And you want me to continue it. The flames in Morwenna's eyes flared brighter. I want you to finish it. The current king is the last of his line. When he dies, the curse dies with him, and you, daughter of my blood, will be the one who decides his fate. I won't kill him. Who said anything about killing? Morwenna's frozen face twisted into something that might have been a smile. You already saved him once. I felt it. Your fire burning through my ice, thawing what should have remained frozen. You did in moments what centuries of magic could not undo. Evelyne's mind raced. Then why are you fighting me? If I can break the curse, why not let me? Because breaking the curse requires sacrifice. The queen stood fully now, ice falling from her body in chunks. Power demands payment. To undo 300 years of accumulated hatred, you must give something of equal weight. Your magic, your life, or his. The choice landed like a physical blow. Evelyne stared at those burning eyes and felt her entire world narrow to 3 impossible options. She could walk away, let Kaelric die, save herself and watch the curse consume him completely. She could sacrifice herself, pour every ounce of her awakening magic into breaking the curse, and hope it was enough before it killed her. Or she could find a third path. Something Morwenna hadn't considered, something that didn't end with death. There has to be another way, Evelyne said. Morwenna laughed again, and the sound was knives on ice. There is no other way. There is only choice. And time is running out, daughter. The curse is accelerating. Soon your king will be nothing but frozen meat walking on 2 legs, and when that happens, his empire will tear itself apart fighting for scraps of power. Why do you care what happens to the empire? I don't. But I care about legacy, and you are mine, the last living piece of magic I created before they destroyed me. Whatever choice you make will define what my existence meant, revenge that endures beyond death, or mercy that breaks the cycle. The ice beneath Evelyne's feet cracked wider. She could feel heat building in her chest, responding to the cold, preparing to defend itself. The dagger in her hand grew warm. And if I choose mercy? She asked carefully. Then you walk a path I could not. Morwenna's burning eyes fixed on hers with something almost like hunger. And perhaps that is what I wanted all along. Not revenge that lasts forever, but proof that love can survive betrayal and still choose forgiveness. Before Evelyne could respond, the tomb door exploded inward. Kaelric stood in the entrance, frost covering his entire body now, his eyes almost completely white. Behind him, the council members scattered, shouting orders, but he ignored them all. His focus locked onto Evelyne with desperate intensity. Get away from her, he said, his voice barely human. Morwenna turned toward him slowly. And here he is, the last king, the final payment for 3 centuries of suffering. She tilted her head, studying him with clinical interest. You love her. I can see it burning in what's left of your frozen heart. How delicious. History repeating itself in reverse. Kaelric's hand went to his sword. I don't care who you are or what you want. Release her, now. The queen laughed. Or what? You'll kill me? I'm already dead, boy. Have been for longer than your family has ruled this frozen wasteland. Evelyne stepped between them, and the movement drew both sets of eyes. She looked at Morwenna first, then at Kaelric, and felt the weight of impossible choices crushing down on her shoulders. But she'd been making impossible choices her whole life. This was just one more. I'll break your curse, she said to Morwenna, but not through sacrifice, not through death, through transformation. The queen's burning eyes narrowed. Explain. Evelyne turned to Kaelric. The curse feeds on isolation, on frozen hearts that can't feel warmth or connection. Every king in your bloodline died alone because the curse made it impossible for them to bond with anyone. Yes, he said roughly. She turned back to Morwenna. But what if he wasn't alone? What if the curse tried to freeze a heart that was already connected to something stronger than ice? Understanding dawned in those flame-bright eyes. A mate bond. Yes, not just protection, not just necessity, a true bond, chosen and acknowledged and strong enough to anchor him to humanity, even when the curse tries to steal it. Morwenna was silent for a long moment. Then she smiled, and it was terrible and beautiful and almost approving. Clever girl, using the very thing the curse was designed to prevent as the weapon to destroy it. But you understand what that means. I do. A mate bond is permanent. It cannot be undone, cannot be broken except through death. You would bind yourself to him for life, give up any chance of freedom or escape, become as trapped by love as I was by betrayal. Evelyne met Kaelric's eyes across the frozen tomb. She saw the deterioration consuming him, saw the desperate hope fighting with brutal realism, saw a man who'd been dying alone for 14 years finally finding something worth living for. And she made her choice. I'm already trapped, she said quietly, by magic I don't understand, by a bloodline I didn't choose, by fires I can't control. At least this trap comes with someone who sees me as more than a curse. Kaelric's expression cracked, just for a moment, long enough for her to see the raw, desperate gratitude underneath. Morwenna watched them both, her frozen face unreadable. Very well. If you choose this path, I will allow it. But know this, daughter, a mate bond forged under these circumstances will be tested in ways you cannot imagine. The curse will fight, the empire will resist, and every person who fears change will try to destroy what you build. Let them try. The queen's smile widened. Then speak the words, both of you. And we will see if love truly is stronger than 300 years of accumulated hate. Evelyne turned to face Kaelric fully. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and caught her hands in his. The cold burned, but she didn't pull away. You don't have to do this, he said roughly. Yes, I do, because you were right. We're survival, for each other. A mate bond is forever, Evelyne. There's no taking it back. Good. I'm tired of temporary. Something fierce and possessive flared in his eyes. Say it then. Choose me, out loud, in front of witnesses. So there's no question about what this is. Evelyne took a breath and felt the heat in her chest expand. Not painful, not destructive, just warm, alive. Hers. I choose you, Kaelric Thornvale, as mate, as king, as the man who saw strength in me when everyone else saw only weakness. I bind my magic to yours, my life to yours, my fire to your ice, until death breaks what I build here. The words hung in the frozen air for one perfect moment. Then Kaelric spoke, his voice raw and absolute. I choose you, Evelyne Drakhar, as mate, as queen, as the woman who refused to break when the world demanded it. I bind my crown to yours, my empire to yours, my ice to your fire, until death claims what we forge here. The moment the words left his mouth, power exploded through the tomb. Not violent, not destructive, just overwhelming. Heat and cold colliding, merging, transforming into something entirely new. The gray consuming Kaelric's body receded in waves, pulled back by fire that didn't burn but healed. Color flooded his skin. Warmth replaced frost, and his eyes, those frozen lake eyes, thawed completely. The mate bond snapped into place like a lock finding its key. Evelyne gasped as sensation flooded through her. Not her own feelings, his, desperate relief, fierce possessive joy, bone-deep exhaustion finally giving way to hope. She could feel his heartbeat as clearly as her own, could sense his presence like a second consciousness living alongside hers. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely irreversible. Morwenna watched it all with burning eyes. Then slowly she began to smile. Well done, she said softly. You found the loophole I left hidden in my own curse. Love freely given, bonds chosen without coercion, magic transformed through acceptance instead of fear. The ice around her body began to crack, not shattering, melting. 300 years of frozen hatred turning to water that pooled at their feet. My work here is finished, daughter. The curse is broken. The bloodline is free. And you, the last piece of magic I created, have proven that even the darkest legacy can be transformed into something beautiful. Morwenna's body dissolved, not dying, just fading, returning to whatever plane of existence she'd been pulled from to deliver this final message. Her last words echoed through the tomb as she disappeared. Rule well, Fire Queen, and never forget the cost of love betrayed. Then she was gone. Evelyne stood in the empty tomb, holding Kaelric's hands, feeling the mate bond thrumming between them like a living thing. The ice on the walls was melting. Water ran in rivers across the floor, and outside she could hear shouting, the council demanding answers, guards calling for reinforcements. Kaelric pulled her close, his arms wrapped around her like he was afraid she might disappear. What did we just do? We broke a 300-year-old curse and bound ourselves together for life. In that order? Apparently. He laughed. Actual laughter, raw and rusty like he'd forgotten how. My council is going to lose their minds. They already think I'm destroying the empire. Well, now you're queen of it, so they'll have to get used to disappointment. Evelyne pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. I don't know how to be a queen. Neither did I when I took the throne. We'll figure it out together. The warmth in his voice, the absolute certainty, should have been reassuring. But Evelyne couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just traded one curse for another. The mate bond thrummed between them, beautiful and binding and completely inescapable. And somewhere deep in her chest, she felt the fire responding, growing, changing, becoming something she didn't fully understand yet. Morwenna had called her the Fire Queen. Evelyne had a terrible feeling she was about to find out exactly what that meant. They emerged from the tomb to chaos. The council stood in a semicircle, weapons drawn, faces ranging from shock to outright fury. Lord Vaelor stood at the front, his expression carefully controlled. My king, he said quietly. What happened in there? Kaelric's voice carried absolute authority. The curse is broken. Lady Drakhar and I have formed a mate bond. And as of this moment, she is your queen. Anyone who has a problem with that can challenge me directly. Silence. Then Lord Theron stepped forward, his hand on his sword hilt. My king, with all respect, a mate bond formed under these circumstances is not legitimate. The council must approve any royal marriage, and Lady Drakhar has not been cleared of the fire accusations. The fires were caused by the curse fighting against Evelyne's magic. Now that the curse is broken, they'll stop. And if they don't? Kaelric's smile was all teeth and ice. Then I'll deal with it personally. But make no mistake, Lord Theron, Evelyne Drakhar is my mate, my queen, and the future of this empire. Question that again, and you'll find yourself on the wrong side of a very short conversation. Theron's jaw worked, but he stepped back. Lord Vaelor remained motionless, his hawk-like eyes fixed on Evelyne with an intensity that made her skin crawl. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and dangerous. Congratulations, my queen. I hope you survive what comes next. Before Evelyne could ask what he meant, Vaelor turned and walked away. The rest of the council followed, their conversations hushed and tense. Evelyne watched them go and felt the mate bond pulse with warning. Kaelric's arm tightened around her waist. What is it? She asked. Vaelor. He's too calm, too accepting. His eyes tracked the older man's retreating form. He spent the last week pushing for your detention, and now he just congratulates you and walks away? Maybe he's accepted defeat. Men like Vaelor don't accept defeat. They adapt. The words settled over Evelyne like a shroud. She looked at the melting ice around the tomb entrance, felt the mate bond connecting her to Kaelric with unbreakable strength, and realized they'd won the battle but not the war. The curse was broken, but the real fight was just beginning, and she had no idea who she could trust. The fires stopped exactly 3 hours after the mate bond formed. Reports came flooding into the palace from every territory that had been burning. Villages that had been consumed by unnatural flames suddenly went cold. Witnesses claimed the fires simply died, not extinguished but withdrawn, like something had called them home. Evelyne stood in Kaelric's private chambers and felt the heat in her chest settle into something controllable. Not gone, never gone, but contained, directed, hers to command instead of a wild thing destroying everything it touched. The mate bond thrummed between them, warm and steady, and through it she could feel Kaelric's exhaustion, not from the curse anymore. From 14 years of fighting alone finally catching up to him now that the immediate threat had passed. He sat at his desk, surrounded by reports and messenger scrolls, his expression carved from stone. The gray had vanished completely from his skin. Color had returned to his face. He looked more human than he had in days, but the weight sitting on his shoulders hadn't lightened at all. Evelyne crossed to him and placed her hand on his shoulder. The mate bond pulsed, and she felt his tension ease fractionally. The council wants an audience, he said quietly. Tomorrow at dawn, formal, with every noble house in attendance. To acknowledge the mate bond? To challenge it. Evelyne's stomach dropped. They can't break a bond that's already formed. No, but they can declare it illegitimate, refuse to recognize me as their king if I don't dissolve it, force a succession crisis that tears the empire apart. He looked up at her, and the exhaustion in his eyes was devastating. I've ruled through fear for 14 years, Evelyne. Kept this empire together through sheer force of will and the threat of execution. But a king needs more than fear to survive. He needs loyalty. And right now, I don't know if I have it. The vulnerability in his voice made her chest ache. This was the man underneath the crown. The one who'd been dying alone and terrified and too proud to admit it. The one who'd chosen her not because she was convenient, but because she was the first person in years who'd looked at him and seen something worth saving. Then we remind them why you're king, she said. We show them that breaking the curse didn't make you weak. It made you stronger. And if they don't believe it, then we make them believe it. Kaelric's hand covered hers, his grip tight. I need you with me, tomorrow. Not standing behind me, beside me, as my equal, my queen. Can you do that? Evelyne thought about the girl who'd stood in Moonveil Palace and accepted rejection without begging. The half-blood witch daughter who'd spent her whole life being told she was unworthy. She'd survived by staying small, by making herself invisible, by never claiming the power that ran in her veins. That version of herself was gone, burned away in the fires of her own awakening magic. Yes, she said. I can do that. Good. Dawn came too fast. Evelyne woke to find Mira standing over her bed with an expression that could have curdled milk. The older woman held a dress that looked like it had been forged from flame. Deep crimson silk that caught the light like living fire, cut in the northern style but with modifications that made it clear this was armor, not decoration. The king had this made for you overnight, Mira said flatly. Apparently, subtlety is no longer part of the strategy. Evelyne sat up and touched the fabric. It was soft but impossibly strong, reinforced with something that felt like metal thread. What is this? Dragon silk, woven with iron and enchantments. It won't burn, won't tear, and it makes a statement that you're not someone to be trifled with. Mira's expression softened fractionally. The king is preparing for war, girl, and he wants everyone in that throne room to know you're his weapon as much as his mate. The words settled over Evelyne like a challenge. She stood and let Mira dress her, feeling the weight of the gown transform her into something new, something dangerous. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The Fire Queen stared back, dark hair pulled into a severe crown braid, face pale but fierce, eyes that burned with purpose instead of fear, and the dress, that impossible crimson dress, made her look like she'd walked out of an inferno and decided to rule it. Mira stepped back and studied her critically. You'll do. Try not to get yourself killed in the first hour. I'll do my best. And girl? Mira's voice dropped lower. Lord Valor has been moving through the palace all night, quiet conversations with nobles who hold military power. Whatever he's planning, it's happening today. Be ready. Evelyne met her eyes in the mirror. Why are you warning me? Because I've served this palace for 30 years. I've watched 3 kings die from that curse. And I'm tired of seeing good people destroyed by ambitious monsters. She turned and walked toward the door, then paused. The king chose you because you refused to break. Don't start now. She left before Evelyne could respond. Meets. The throne room had been transformed overnight. Every noble house in the Northern Empire had sent representatives, and they packed the massive space until there was barely room to breathe. Guards lined the walls in formations that looked more like battle positions than ceremony, and at the far end, on the raised dais, sat 2 thrones. One carved from black ice, one carved from flame-red stone. Evelyne's breath caught. The second throne hadn't existed yesterday. Kaelric had commissioned it overnight and had it installed beside his own. A declaration that couldn't be misunderstood. She was his equal, his queen, and anyone who challenged that challenged him directly. Kaelric stood beside the thrones, dressed in full ceremonial armor that made him look like a weapon forged from winter itself. When he saw Evelyne enter, something fierce and possessive flared in his eyes. The mate bond pulsed with approval. She walked through the crowd, feeling every gaze on her, and climbed the dais to stand beside him. He caught her hand and raised it to his lips. The gesture was deliberate, public, a claim that left no room for interpretation. My queen, he said quietly, and the words carried through the silent room like thunder. Then he turned to face the assembled nobles, and his voice rang with absolute authority. You called this audience to challenge the legitimacy of my mate bond, so challenge it. Who speaks first? Lord Theron stepped forward immediately. My king, a mate bond requires council approval before it can be recognized as legitimate. You formed this bond without consultation, without proper ceremony, in direct violation of succession law. Succession law applies to marriages of political convenience. Mate bonds are recognized by blood and magic, not council votes. The law makes no distinction. Then the law is wrong. The blunt statement sent ripples of shock through the crowd. Kaelric's expression didn't change, but Evelyne could feel his tension through the bond. He was pushing, hard, forcing the council to either back down or escalate. Lady Ashlyn spoke up, her voice sharp. My king, even if we accept the bond as legitimate, Lady Drakhar has not been cleared of the fire accusations. Hundreds are dead, villages destroyed. You cannot expect us to crown a woman whose magic may have caused that destruction. The fires were caused by the curse fighting against Evelyne's awakening power. The curse is broken. The fires have stopped. Your accusation is based on fear, not evidence. Then let her prove it. Let her demonstrate control over her magic before the entire court. If she truly commands the fire instead of being commanded by it, show us. The challenge hung in the air like a blade. Evelyne felt Kaelric's hand tighten on hers. Through the mate bond, she felt his warning. Don't. It's a trap. They want you to lose control in front of witnesses. But Evelyne had spent her whole life being told to stay small, to hide her power, to apologize for existing. She was done apologizing. She released Kaelric's hand and stepped forward to the edge of the dais. You want proof I control the fire? Fine, I'll give you proof. She raised her hand, palm up, and called the heat. It answered immediately, not wild, not destructive, just warm, alive. Hers. Flame bloomed in her palm, small and contained, burning without fuel or smoke. The temperature in the throne room spiked, and nobles backed away instinctively. Evelyne let the fire grow, larger, brighter, until it illuminated the entire room with golden light. Then she closed her fist, and the flame vanished instantly. The silence was absolute. She met Lady Ashlyn's eyes. I don't fear my magic, I command it. And if anyone in this room doubts that, I'll be happy to provide a more dramatic demonstration. Ashlyn's face had gone pale, but she didn't back down. Control in peacetime means nothing. The true test of a queen is how she responds when her empire is threatened. Before Evelyne could respond, the throne room doors exploded inward. Guards flooded in, their armor scorched, faces covered in soot and blood. Behind them came civilians, hundreds of them, screaming and pushing and desperate. The captain of the guard stumbled forward, gasping. My king, rebellion, the Eastern Quarter, Lord Vaelor has declared you unfit to rule. He's rallying the military houses to his banner and marching on the palace. The throne room erupted into chaos. Kaelric's voice cut through the noise like a blade. How many soldiers? 3,000, maybe more. Every house that opposed the mate bond has joined him. They're demanding Lady Drakhar be executed and you abdicate in favor of a council-chosen successor. Evelyne felt the mate bond flood with cold, lethal fury. She looked at Kaelric and saw the transformation happen in real time. The exhausted king vanished, replaced by the warrior who'd crushed 3 rebellions before turning 25. Seal the palace, he said quietly. Evacuate civilians to the inner sanctum. Mobilize every loyal guard we have, and someone bring me Lord Vaelor's head on a pike. The guards saluted and ran. Kaelric turned to the assembled nobles, and the temperature dropped 30 degrees. You wanted to challenge my authority. Congratulations, you've gotten exactly what you asked for. Now you have a choice. Stand with me and fight to keep this empire intact, or join Vaelor's rebellion and die with him when I crush it. Lord Theron stepped forward, his hand on his sword. My king, Vaelor commands 3,000 soldiers. You have maybe 800 loyal guards in the palace. The math doesn't favor you. The math never favors me. I win anyway. This isn't about winning a battle. It's about what comes after. If you slaughter 3,000 of your own citizens to keep a controversial queen, you'll destroy the empire you're trying to save. Kaelric's smile was all teeth and ice. Then I'll build a new one from the ashes. He turned to Evelyne, and through the mate bond she felt his desperation, his fear. Not for himself. For her. For what would happen if Valor's forces breached the palace and got their hands on the Fire Queen. "I need you to stay here," he said quietly. "Protected. Safe. While I deal with this." Every instinct in Evelyne's body screamed in protest. She'd just claimed her power in front of the entire court, proven she could control the fire, and now he wanted her to hide while he fought her battles? "No," she said flatly. "Evelyne, no. You made me your queen, your equal. That means I stand beside you when the empire burns, not behind you, not hidden away like some fragile thing that needs protection. If you die out there, I lose everything. If I hide in here while you fight alone, you've already lost." The mate bond pulsed between them, carrying the weight of impossible choices. Kaelric stared at her, and she could see the war happening behind his eyes. The king who needed to protect what he loved, the warrior who needed every advantage to survive, the man who was finally learning that sometimes love meant trusting instead of controlling. He reached out and caught her face in both hands. "If you do this, you follow my orders. No heroics. No sacrificing yourself to save me. We survive together or not at all. Understood?" "Understood." He kissed her, hard, desperate, like he was trying to memorize the taste of her in case it was the last time. Then he released her and turned to face the throne room. "Anyone who wants to fight, arm yourselves and meet me at the eastern gates in 10 minutes. Anyone who wants to run, the northern tunnels are still clear. Choose now." Half the nobles fled immediately. The other half, the ones who'd been watching Evelyne summon fire with calculating eyes, moved toward the armory. Lord Theron remained, his expression grim. "I'll fight with you, my king, not because I approve of this bond, but because Vaelor's rebellion threatens everything our family's built. If he wins, the empire falls into chaos. I don't care why you fight, just don't get in my way." Theron nodded and left. Duke Martin approached, older and weathered but still solid. "My men are yours, my king. We'll hold the eastern wall." "Good. Position them at the main gate. No one gets through unless I say so." More nobles stepped forward. Not all of them. Not even most of them. But enough. Enough to maybe hold the palace long enough to break Valor's momentum. Evelyne watched it all and felt something fierce settle in her chest. These people weren't fighting for her, weren't even fighting because they believed in the mate bond. They were fighting because the alternative was worse, because letting Valor win meant admitting that ambition and fear could destroy centuries of unified rule. It was a fragile alliance built on necessity instead of loyalty. But it was enough to start. But Chates. The eastern quarter burned. Not from Evelyne's magic. From Valor's soldiers setting fire to buildings as they marched toward the palace, creating chaos and smoke to cover their advance. Civilians fled through the streets, some toward the palace seeking protection, others away from the fighting entirely. Kaelric stood on the palace walls and surveyed the approaching army with cold calculation. 3,000 soldiers in formation, moving with military precision. Siege equipment being hauled forward. Archers taking positions on rooftops. This wasn't a spontaneous rebellion. This was a planned coup. Evelyne stood beside him, feeling the heat of the fires below calling to her magic. She could stop them, could pull the flames away from the buildings and redirect them toward Valor's forces. But doing that would prove every fear the council had about her, would confirm that she was a weapon too dangerous to be trusted. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. Kaelric's eyes never left the approaching army. "We give Valor exactly what he wants, a confrontation, public, witnessed, where everyone can see what happens to traitors who challenge the throne. He has 3,000 soldiers. He has 3,000 men who think they're fighting for the Empire's safety. The moment they realize they're fighting for one ambitious lord's grab at power, half of them will turn." Kaelric's hand went to his sword. "We just need to survive long enough to make that happen." The first volley of arrows struck the palace walls. Guards scrambled for cover as iron-tipped shafts rained down from the rooftops. 2 men fell, screaming, arrows through their throats and chests. The scent of blood hit the air, sharp and metallic. Kaelric's voice rang out clear and absolute. "Archers, return fire. Target their siege equipment first. I want those battering rams destroyed before they reach the gates." The palace archers responded immediately, their arrows finding targets with brutal efficiency. Vaelor's soldiers fell, but more rushed forward to take their places. The battle had begun. Evelyne watched it unfold and felt the mate bond pulse with Kaelric's battle focus. No fear, no hesitation, just cold tactical assessment and the absolute certainty that he would win because losing wasn't acceptable. She'd seen men fight before, had watched duels and skirmishes and bar brawls in Moonveil. But this was different. This was a king defending his throne with the kind of ruthless efficiency that came from 14 years of crushing rebellions. And standing beside him, feeling his mind work through the mate bond, Evelyne understood something fundamental about power. It wasn't about being the strongest or the most feared. It was about being willing to do whatever it took to survive when everything was on the line, even if it meant burning your own empire to the ground to save it. The eastern gates shuddered under the first impact of a battering ram. Kaelric turned to Duke Martin. "How long can the gates hold?" 10 minutes, maybe 15 if we reinforce them." "Do it, and prepare for close combat. When those gates fall, Vaelor's forces will flood through. I want every advantage we can get." Martin saluted and ran. Evelyne felt the heat building in her chest again. The fires in the eastern quarter were growing, spreading, feeding on the chaos. Her magic responded to them, recognizing kindred flame, wanting to join. She could end this, could unleash the full force of her awakening power and burn Vaelor's army where they stood. But that would make her the monster everyone feared, would prove that the Fire Queen was too dangerous to live, would destroy any chance she had of ruling beside Kaelric as something more than a weapon to be pointed at enemies. "I can stop the fires," she said quietly. Kaelric looked at her, and through the mate bond she felt his understanding. "Not yet. We need to see what Vaelor does first. If he's willing to burn his own people to get to us, the soldiers will notice. And if they don't, then we adapt." The gate shuddered again. Cracks appeared in the reinforced wood. Vaelor's soldiers were chanting now, their voices rising in rhythm with each impact of the ram. "Traitor King, Witch Queen, burn them both." The words hit harder than the battering ram. Evelyne felt something cold settle over her. Not fear. Something worse. The understanding that no matter what she did, a significant portion of this empire would always see her as a curse, an infection, something that needed to be cut out before it destroyed them all. She'd spent her whole life trying to prove she was more than her mother's legacy. And here she was, facing an army that wanted her dead for exactly that reason. The gates exploded inward. Soldiers poured through the breach, weapons raised, screaming battle cries that spoke of righteousness and fury. Duke Martin's guards met them head-on, and the clash of steel on steel rang through the courtyard like breaking bones. Blood hit the stone. Men fell. The scent of death flooded the air. Kaelric drew his sword and moved toward the stairs, but Evelyne caught his arm. "Wait," she said. "For what?" "For Vaelor to show himself. This is his rebellion. He'll want to be seen leading it." Through the chaos of the battle below, a figure emerged on horseback. Tall, silver-haired, carrying a sword that looked like it had been forged specifically for this moment. Lord Vaelor. He rode through his own soldiers without fear, his eyes fixed on the palace walls where Kaelric and Evelyne stood. When he was close enough to be heard, he raised his sword, and his voice carried over the sound of fighting. "Kaelric Thornvale, you stand accused of betraying your empire by binding yourself to corrupted magic. Abdicate now, and I will show mercy. Refuse, and I will take your throne by force and execute the witch who poisoned you." Kaelric's smile was cold and sharp. "Come and try, Vaelor. Let's see how long you last." Vaelor's expression didn't change. "I didn't want this, my king. I served your family for 30 years, watched the curse destroy your father and grandfather. I tried to save you from the same fate. But you chose her over the Empire's safety. You left me no choice. You always had a choice. You chose ambition over loyalty. I chose the Empire over one man's selfish need for warmth." The words landed like arrows. Evelyne felt Kaelric's fury through the mate bond, white-hot and barely controlled. He started to respond, but she stepped forward first. Her voice rang out clear and absolute. "You want to know what I am, Lord Vaelor? I'm the daughter of a woman you executed 8 years ago to keep the curse alive. I'm the descendant of the queen who created that curse because men like you destroyed her for being inconvenient. And I'm the Fire Queen who's going to burn your rebellion to ash and rebuild this empire on loyalty instead of fear." She raised both hands, and flame erupted from her palms. Not wild, not destructive. Controlled, deliberate, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The fires in the eastern quarter responded immediately. They pulled away from the buildings, no longer consuming but retreating, drawn toward Evelyne like iron to a magnet. The flames coalesced in the air above the courtyard, forming a wall of living fire between Vaelor's soldiers and the palace. The fighting stopped. Every soldier, rebel and loyalist alike, stared at the impossible display of power. Evelyne let the fire burn for 5 perfect seconds, making sure everyone understood exactly what she was capable of. Then she spoke again, and her voice carried the weight of 300 years of suppressed magic finally unleashed. "You called me a curse, a witch, something that needed to be destroyed. But curses don't save dying kings. They don't stop fires. They don't choose mercy when they could choose destruction." She looked directly at Vaelor. "I am not my mother. I am not Queen Morwenna. I am Evelyne Drakhar, and I choose what I become. And right now, I choose to give you one chance to surrender before I stop being merciful." Vaelor stared at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, and it was terrible and knowing and completely without fear. "You think power makes you strong, girl? Power makes you a target. And I've been preparing for this moment since the day your mother died." He raised his hand, and Evelyne felt something slam into her chest. Not physical, magical, cold and precise and devastating. The firewall collapsed. Evelyne gasped and fell to her knees, pain exploding through her body like ice in her veins. Through the mate bond, she felt Kaelric's answering roar of fury, but it sounded distant, muffled. Vaelor's voice cut through the chaos. "Did you really think you were the only one who studied forbidden magic? I've spent 30 years learning how to kill witch descendants. Your mother taught me everything I needed to know before I burned her." He gestured, and the cold intensified. Evelyne's vision blurred. She could feel her magic trying to respond, trying to fight back, but something was blocking it, containing it, turning her own power against her. This was how her mother died. Trapped, helpless, destroyed by someone who'd learned to weaponize the very magic meant to protect. Through the fading mate bond, she felt Kaelric moving, running, desperate to reach her before the cold killed her completely. But Vaelor was faster. He raised his sword, and Evelyne saw her death reflected in the blade. Then the world exploded into flame. The flame didn't come from Evelyne. It came from Kaelric. He stood between her and Vaelor's descending blade, his entire body wreathed in fire that burned gold instead of red, not destroying him, protecting him. The sword struck the flames and shattered, pieces of steel raining down across the blood-soaked courtyard. Vaelor stumbled backward, shock breaking through his carefully controlled expression for the first time. Kaelric's voice was rough, inhuman, like he was speaking through something older than himself. "You forgot something important, Vaelor. A mate bond doesn't just connect two people. It merges their magic, makes them stronger together than they ever were apart." He reached down and pulled Evelyne to her feet, his touch burning away the ice Vaelor had forced into her veins. The moment their skin connected, power exploded between them. Not fire alone, not ice alone. Something entirely new. Heat and cold woven together, balanced, transformed into a force that made the air itself shimmer. Through the mate bond, Evelyne felt Kaelric's desperation, his fury, his absolute refusal to let her die after finally finding something worth living for. And underneath it all, she felt something she'd never experienced from another person: complete trust. He was giving her access to his power, his strength, everything he had, offered without reservation or fear. She'd spent her whole life being told that her magic was a curse, something to suppress and hide and apologize for. But standing here, connected to Kaelric through bonds deeper than blood, she finally understood what her mother had been trying to teach her. Power wasn't the curse. Fear was. Evelyne straightened, feeling the ice in her veins transform into steam, and raised both hands toward Vaelor. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 300 years of suppressed magic finally set free. "You killed my mother because you were afraid of what she could become. You kept the curse alive because frozen kings were easier to control than whole ones. And now you're trying to kill me for the same reason." She took a step forward, and flame bloomed in her palms. Not wild, controlled, devastating. "But you made one critical mistake, Lord Vaelor. You taught me exactly what to be afraid of, and I'm done being afraid. She unleashed everything. Fire poured from her hands in torrents, not aimed at Vaelor directly, but at the ground between them. The stone melted, the air superheated, and the magical binding he'd placed on her magic shattered under the sheer force of power she commanded now that she'd stopped fighting herself. Vaelor tried to counter with his own magic, the forbidden techniques he'd learned from torturing witch descendants for 30 years. Ice formed in walls around him, protective barriers meant to contain flame. But Evelyne's fire wasn't natural. It was born from bloodline magic merged with mate bond strength, and it burned through his defenses like they were paper. Kaelric moved beside her, his own power adding to hers, and together they created something no one in that courtyard had ever seen. A maelstrom of fire and ice spiraling together, beautiful and terrible, controlled chaos that spoke of what two people could accomplish when they stopped fighting alone. Vaelor's barriers crumbled. His magic failed, and for the first time in 30 years, the man who'd orchestrated countless deaths from the shadows found himself facing the consequences with nowhere to hide. Evelyne could have killed him, could have let the fire consume him completely, turning him to ash as punishment for everything he'd done. Her mother, the curse, the rebellion, all of it deserved death. But she'd learned something fundamental in the tomb when Morwenna offered her the choice between revenge and transformation. Becoming a monster to punish monsters just created more monsters, and she was done with that cycle. Evelyne closed her fist, and the fire died instantly. Vaelor collapsed to his knees, his clothing scorched, his face covered in burns, but alive, breathing, broken but not destroyed. The courtyard fell silent. Every soldier, rebel and loyalist alike, stared at the Fire Queen who'd just proven she could kill with a thought, but chose mercy instead. Kaelric's hand found hers, and through the mate bond she felt his understanding, his approval, his recognition that she'd just done something he'd never been able to do in 14 years of ruling. She'd shown strength without cruelty, power without destruction, the kind of leadership that inspired loyalty instead of demanding it through fear. Kaelric's voice rang out clear and absolute. Lord Vaelor, you stand accused of treason, murder, and conspiracy to overthrow the crown. Your crimes are witnessed by every person in this courtyard. Surrender now, and you'll face trial. Resist, and I'll let my queen finish what she started. Vaelor looked up at them, his face twisted with pain and something that might have been bitter resignation. You think this ends with me? The moment you took that witch as your mate, you signed the Empire's death warrant. There will always be others who see what I see. A king compromised by corrupted magic. A throne built on forbidden power. You've won the battle, Kaelric, but you've lost the war. Then I'll fight that war every day for the rest of my life. And I'll win it the same way I won this. By being stronger than the people who think fear is the only path to control. He gestured to Duke Martin, who'd survived the battle with blood covering his armor, but fire still burning in his eyes. Take Vaelor to the dungeons, treat his wounds, and prepare him for trial. He'll answer for every crime publicly, so there's no question about justice. Martin moved forward with guards, binding Vaelor's hands and hauling him to his feet. The former advisor didn't struggle, just stared at Evelyne with eyes that held more calculation than defeat. You should have killed me, he said quietly as they dragged him past. Mercy is weakness, and weakness gets queens murdered in their sleep. Evelyne met his gaze without flinching. Then I guess I'll sleep lightly, but I'd rather risk assassination than become the kind of ruler who executes enemies to feel safe. Vaelor laughed, a broken sound that echoed across the silent courtyard. You're more naive than your mother, and she died screaming. The words hit like a physical blow, but Evelyne forced herself to breathe through the rage. Through the mate bond, she felt Kaelric's answering fury, his instinct to draw his sword and end Vaelor where he stood. But he didn't move, didn't react, just squeezed her hand once and let the guards take Vaelor away. That restraint, that ability to choose strategy over emotion, even when everything inside him screamed for violence, was why he'd survived 14 years as king. And now, connected through the mate bond, it was a lesson Evelyne could learn directly, could feel in her bones instead of just understanding intellectually. Being strong didn't mean destroying everyone who threatened you. It meant being secure enough in your own power that threats became manageable problems instead of existential crises. The soldiers who'd fought for Vaelor began lowering their weapons, not all at once, but in groups. Small surrenders that grew into a wave as they realized their leader was defeated and the alternative to surrender was death. Lord Theron stepped forward, his armor dented and bloodied, but his sword still in hand. He looked at Kaelric and Evelyne standing together on the palace steps, united by more than just politics or convenience, and something shifted in his scarred face. "My king," he said quietly. "My queen. House Theron stands with you. Not because the law demands it, but because what I just witnessed proves you're stronger together than this empire has been in generations." He knelt. One by one, other nobles followed, Duke Martin, Lady Ashlyn, even some who'd been neutral during the council debates. They knelt not in defeat, but in acknowledgement of something they'd just seen proven with blood and fire. A king and queen who could have destroyed their enemies but chose transformation instead. It was a fragile peace, built on respect earned in battle rather than loyalty freely given. But it was enough to rebuild from. Kaelric's voice carried across the courtyard with quiet authority. "Rise, all of you. The fight is over. Now comes the harder part. Rebuilding what we burned, healing what we broke, and proving to every person in this empire that the mate bond didn't weaken the throne. It saved it." The nobles rose slowly, their expressions ranging from cautious optimism to barely concealed skepticism. This was the moment that would define everything, not the battle, not the magic, but how they chose to move forward from carnage into something that might eventually become stability. Evelyne looked at the blood-soaked courtyard, the burned buildings in the eastern quarter, the bodies of soldiers who'd died fighting for leaders who'd lied to them about what they were protecting. So much destruction. So many lives ended because ambitious men couldn't accept change. And through it all, she'd discovered something about herself that her mother had tried to teach her before they took her away. Power wasn't about domination. It was about choice. The choice to burn or heal. To destroy or transform. To become the monster people feared or the leader they needed. Evelyne had made her choice. Now she just had to survive it. Bant. The trial lasted 3 days. Kaelric insisted it be public, held in the Great Hall where anyone who wanted to witness could attend. No secret executions, no quiet disappearances. Every crime Vaelor committed would be exposed and judged by the same laws he'd used to control others for 30 years. Evelyne sat beside Kaelric on the newly installed dual thrones, feeling the weight of every gaze in that packed hall. Some looks were hostile, others curious. A few held something that might have been hope. She'd learned quickly that being queen meant existing under constant scrutiny. Every word analyzed, every gesture interpreted as policy, every moment of weakness seen as proof she didn't deserve the throne. It was exhausting, but it was also clarifying, because the people who watched her with contempt weren't seeing Evelyne Drakhar anymore. They were seeing their own fears reflected back. Fear of change, fear of power they couldn't control, fear that the empire they'd built on rigid hierarchy might transform into something they didn't recognize. And that fear, Evelyne was learning, said far more about them than it did about her. Vaelor stood in chains at the center of the hall, his burns healing slowly, his expression carefully neutral. He'd refused counsel, refused to defend himself, just stood there and listened as witness after witness detailed his crimes. The execution of Seraphine Drakhar based on fabricated evidence. The manipulation of 3 kings through carefully administered poisons that accelerated the curse. The orchestration of political marriages that weakened rival houses. The quiet murders of anyone who questioned his authority too loudly. 30 years of calculated cruelty laid bare for everyone to see. When the final witness finished, Kaelric stood. The hall fell silent instantly. "Lord Vaelor," he said quietly, "you've heard the accusations. The evidence is overwhelming. Do you have anything to say before judgment is passed?" Vaelor looked up at the dual thrones, and for the first time since his capture, something raw showed through his carefully controlled mask. Not regret, not remorse, just bitter acceptance of a game played and lost. "I did what I thought necessary to protect this empire from itself. Every action I took was calculated to preserve stability. Order. The hierarchy that kept 6 kingdoms unified under one throne." His voice grew stronger. "You call it cruelty. I call it pragmatism. And history will judge which of us was right. History will judge that you murdered an innocent woman and tortured her daughter for power. I killed a witch who would have destroyed everything our ancestors built, and I tried to stop her daughter from doing the same. If that makes me a monster, then so be it, but at least I'm a monster who acted with purpose instead of sentiment." The words echoed through the hall, and Evelyn felt the temperature shift. Some nobles nodded slightly, agreeing with Valor's twisted logic, even if they couldn't say so publicly. Others looked disgusted. Most just looked tired of the whole bloody mess. Kaelric's expression didn't change, but through the mate bond, Evelyne felt his cold fury. "The council will vote on your sentence. Death, exile, or life imprisonment. You have 1 hour to make peace with whichever they choose." He sat back down, and the council began their deliberations. Evelyne watched Valor's face and saw no fear there, no desperation, just calm acceptance. He'd played the game. He'd lost. And whatever came next was just the natural conclusion of choices made decades ago. There was something almost admirable about that resignation. The ability to face consequences without begging or bargaining or trying to shift blame. It was more dignity than most tyrants managed. The council voted quickly. 15 voices calling for death. 8 for life imprisonment. 3 for exile. Death won. Kaelric stood again, and his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Lord Valor, you are sentenced to death by execution at dawn tomorrow. May whatever comes after be kinder than what you created here." Valor bowed his head in acknowledgement. No dramatics, no final speeches, just quiet acceptance. The guards led him away, and the hall began to empty. Nobles filing out in hushed conversations, processing what they'd witnessed, already calculating how this shift in power would affect their own positions. Evelyne remained seated, feeling the exhaustion settle into her bones. 3 days of testimony. 3 days of reliving her mother's death through witness accounts. 3 days of watching the man who'd orchestrated it all stand there without remorse. And tomorrow, she'd watch him die. Kaelric's hand found hers. "You don't have to attend the execution." "Yes, I do." "Why?" "Because my mother died alone, burned by people who called her a monster without ever understanding what she was trying to accomplish. The least I can do is bear witness when her murderer faces the same fate." Through the mate bond, she felt his understanding, his recognition that some wounds needed to be seen to heal. That closure didn't come from avoiding pain, but from walking through it deliberately and emerging on the other side. "Then we attend together," he said quietly. Bam. Dawn came cold and gray. The execution platform had been erected in the main courtyard, visible from every window in the palace. A deliberate choice. Kaelric wanted everyone to see that justice applied to nobles and commoners alike. That 30 years of service didn't buy immunity from consequences. Thousands gathered to witness. Some cheering for blood, others silent and grim. Most just there because executions were public spectacles, and refusing to attend would be noted. Evelyne stood beside Kaelric on the raised platform reserved for royalty, feeling the weight of the crown Mira had placed on her head that morning. Not ceremonial. Actual crown. Gold worked with symbols of fire and ice intertwined. A statement that she was no longer the rejected half-blood daughter, but the Fire Queen who'd helped break a 300-year curse. It felt heavier than she'd expected. Not the physical weight, the responsibility. Valor was brought out in chains, his head held high, his expression calm. He looked at the crowd without fear, then turned his gaze to Evelyne and Kaelric. "Any last words?" Kaelric asked formally. Valor was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his voice carried across the silent courtyard. "I served 3 kings, watched all of them slowly lose their humanity to a curse I could not break. I made choices I thought would preserve what they built, even if those choices required blood." He looked directly at Evelyne. "Your mother understood that. In the end, she knew exactly what I was, and still tried to save you from the same fate. That's why I respected her, even as I killed her. She was strong enough to do what was necessary." Evelyne's hands clenched at her sides. "My mother tried to break the curse because she believed transformation was possible. You kept it alive because you preferred broken kings you could control. Perhaps, or perhaps we were both right in different ways." He smiled, bitter and knowing. "You'll understand eventually. When ruling, this empire grinds away all the idealism and leaves only survival instinct. When you make choices that horrify you but keep your people alive. When you become exactly what you swore you'd never be because the alternative is worse. I'll never become you. No. You'll become something else. Something this empire has never seen before. And I find myself genuinely curious about whether it will be better or just differently broken. He knelt without being told, placing his head on the execution block. The executioner raised his axe. Evelyne watched, forcing herself not to look away. This was the price of justice. The cost of transformation. Blood paid for blood, and cycles ended when someone was brave enough to break them, even knowing the breaking would hurt. The axe fell. It was over in seconds. Lord Vaelor, chief advisor to 3 kings, orchestrator of countless deaths, died the same way Evelyne's mother had. Publicly. Witnessed. Reduced to a cautionary tale about ambition and the limits of pragmatism. The crowd erupted. Some cheering, others silent. A few openly weeping for reasons Evelyne couldn't begin to guess. She stood there feeling hollow. Not satisfied, not vindicated, just tired. Bone-deep exhausted from carrying the weight of other people's choices and trying to build something better from the wreckage they left behind. Kaelric's arm wrapped around her waist, solid and warm. Through the mate bond, she felt his understanding. His recognition that some victories felt like losses, and justice didn't always heal the wounds it was meant to address. "It's done," he said quietly. "Yes." "Do you feel better?" Evelyne thought about that. About her mother burning while crowds cheered. About Vaelor's head rolling across blood-stained wood. About 300 years of accumulated cruelty finally ending not with triumph, but with exhausted relief. "No," she said honestly, "but I feel like maybe we can start healing now. And that's something." The months that followed were harder than the battle. Rebuilding an empire required more than just defeating enemies. It required changing systems, redistributing power, dismantling the structures Vaelor had built to maintain control, and replacing them with something that might eventually become stability. Evelyne threw herself into the work with the same intensity she'd once used to survive Moonveil. She met with noble houses who still viewed her with suspicion and proved through sheer competence that witchblood didn't make her incompetent. She worked with Kaelric to reform laws that had kept half-bloods and magic users suppressed for generations. She traveled to the villages that had burned and helped rebuild them with her own hands. Slowly, grudgingly, the Empire began to accept her. Not because she was perfect, not because everyone agreed with her policies, but because she showed up every day and did the work without complaint or expectation of immediate gratitude. And through it all, the mate bond connected her to Kaelric in ways that went deeper than politics or strategy. She felt his exhaustion when 14-hour council meetings drained him, felt his quiet satisfaction when reforms they implemented actually worked, felt his fierce protective pride every time she stood before hostile nobles and refused to back down. And he felt hers, her grief for a mother she'd lost too young, her determination to prove that transformation was possible, her slowly growing confidence that maybe, just maybe, she deserved to be here. 6 months after Vaelor's execution, Evelyne stood on the palace walls at sunset and watched snow begin to fall over Frostmere. Real snow. Natural. Not the curse-tainted ice that had plagued the Empire for centuries. Spring had come and gone. Summer had burned bright and fierce. And now winter returned, but different. Softer. The kind of cold that could be survived with proper preparation instead of the killing freeze that had defined the North for generations. The curse truly was broken. Kaelric found her there, his cloak wrapped against the evening chill, and stood beside her in comfortable silence. They'd learned to communicate through the mate bond in ways that didn't require words. Emotions flowing back and forth, understanding built on shared experience instead of explanation. "The council approved the final reform today," he said eventually. "Half-bloods can now hold military positions. It passed by 2 votes. Evelyne smiled slightly. Progress. Slow progress. Better than no progress. He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes was complicated. Proud. Exhausted. Grateful. "I couldn't have done this without you." "Yes, you could have. It would have just taken longer and hurt more. Maybe. Or maybe I would have given up and let the curse take me because fighting alone was too hard." He caught her hand and raised it to his lips. "You saved me, Evelyne. Not just from the curse. From myself." She thought about the frozen king who'd claimed her in Moonveil, The man who'd been dying alone for 14 years because he'd forgotten how to let anyone close. The warrior who'd crushed rebellions through sheer brutal force because it was the only language he knew. And she thought about the man standing beside her now, still fierce, still capable of devastating violence when necessary, but tempered by connection, softened by the knowledge that strength could be gentle and power could be shared. "We saved each other," she said quietly. "That's what the mate bond means. Neither of us could have survived this alone." "Do you regret it? Binding yourself to me? Giving up any chance of freedom?" Evelyne considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, she'd been the rejected half-blood daughter with nothing to lose and a legacy of shame she couldn't escape. Now she was a queen, a symbol, a woman with actual power to change the world she'd been born into. But she was also trapped, bound to Kaelric for life, unable to leave even if she wanted to. Her magic merged with his in ways that couldn't be undone, and somehow, impossibly, she was okay with that. "I spent my whole life running from things I couldn't control," she said. "My bloodline, my mother's legacy, the expectations of people who wanted me to be small and quiet and ashamed. And when you claimed me in Moonveil, I thought I was just trading one trap for another." She turned to meet his eyes. "But this trap came with someone who sees me as powerful instead of cursed, who trusts me to make decisions that affect millions, who stands beside me instead of demanding I kneel. So no, I don't regret it, even on the hard days when I want to burn the whole empire down and start over." "M'sieur." Kaelric laughed, and the sound was warm and genuine. "Give it time. We might still burn it down and start over, just more strategically than Valor would have liked. I'll hold you to that." They stood together watching snow fall over an empire that was slowly, painfully learning to transform. It wasn't perfect, probably never would be, but it was theirs, built on choices made deliberately instead of fear inherited from ancestors who'd died centuries ago. Below, in the courtyard, Evelyne could see servants lighting lanterns for the evening, soldiers changing guard shifts, civilians moving through the palace grounds without fear because the rebellion had been crushed and stability was slowly returning. Normal life. The kind her mother had died trying to make possible. "I've been thinking," Kaelric said carefully, "about legacy, about what we leave behind when we're gone." "That's morbid. That's realistic. We broke a 300-year curse, but we didn't eliminate the hatred that created it. There will always be people who fear change, who want to return to the old ways because familiar oppression feels safer than uncertain transformation." Evelyne knew he was right. They'd won the battle, reformed some laws, earned grudging acceptance from nobles who would rather see her dead. But changing hearts took generations, not months. "So what do we do?" she asked. "We build something that outlasts us. Schools that teach magic as skill instead of curse. Laws that protect the vulnerable instead of just the powerful. A legacy that makes it harder for the next Valor to undo what we're creating." "And if it's not enough?" Kaelric's hand tightened on hers. "Then we do it anyway, because the alternative is giving up. And I didn't survive 14 years of a death curse just to surrender to cynicism now." The determination in his voice made Evelyne's chest tighten. This was the man who'd seen her refuse to break in Moonveil and recognize kindred strength, who'd claimed her not because she was convenient, but because she represented possibility in a life that had felt like slow, inevitable death. Who'd bet his entire empire on the belief that love could be stronger than 3 centuries of accumulated hate. And somehow, impossibly, he'd been right. "Then we build," she said, "together, until the empire we leave behind is strong enough to survive without us." "Together," he agreed. Bet. 10 years later, Evelyne stood in the same great hall where she'd been presented as queen and watched young women with magic in their blood take their places in the newly established Academy of Elemental Arts. Not hidden, not ashamed, wearing their power like armor instead of apology. The half-blood laws had been abolished 5 years ago. The witch trials officially declared crimes against humanity. And the empire that had once burned Seraphine Drakhar for existing had transformed into something that protected her daughter's legacy instead of destroying it. It wasn't perfect. There were still nobles who muttered about corrupted bloodlines and traditional values. Still villages where old prejudices died hard. Still moments when Evelyne wanted to burn the whole system down and start from scratch. But there were also these moments. when she could see tangible proof that transformation was possible, that cycles could be broken, that the choices made in desperation and blood could eventually become foundations for something better. Kaelric stood beside her, older now, silver threading through his dark hair, but stronger than he'd been in those dying days before the curse broke. The mate bond had settled into something comfortable, deep, a connection so fundamental she couldn't remember what it felt like to exist without it. Their children, two daughters with fire in their veins and ice in their eyes, sat in the front row watching the ceremony with the kind of fierce attention that reminded Evelyne of herself at that age. Learning, calculating, already understanding that power came with responsibility and legacy was built through choices made daily instead of grand gestures. "Your mother would be proud," Kaelric said quietly. Evelyne felt tears prick her eyes, but she didn't look away from the ceremony. "I hope so. I hope she's somewhere watching all this and knows her death wasn't meaningless, that she bought me time to finish what she started. She didn't just buy you time, she gave you purpose. Everything you've built, every life you've changed, every law you've reformed carries her legacy forward." It was true. Seraphine Drakhar had died alone and afraid, burned by people who couldn't imagine a world where witch blood wasn't a curse. But her daughter had survived, had claimed the power everyone feared, had proven that transformation was possible even when it seemed impossible. And now, 10 years after the curse broke, the empire that had killed her mother protected women just like her. That was legacy. That was what happened when someone refused to let trauma define them and instead used it as fuel to build something better. The ceremony concluded with the young women pledging to use their magic in service of the empire's growth and protection. Not as weapons, not as tools, as citizens with skills valuable enough to be cultivated instead of suppressed. Evelyne watched them leave the hall with their heads held high, and she felt something settle in her chest. Not satisfaction exactly, more like quiet acknowledgement that the work she'd started would continue long after she was gone. That night, lying in bed beside Kaelric with moonlight streaming through the windows, Evelyne finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything they'd survived. The rejection in Moonveil that had felt like the end of the world, the dying king who'd claimed her in front of 1,000 witnesses, the curse that had nearly killed them both, the rebellion that had tested whether mercy was strength or weakness, the slow grinding work of transforming an empire one reform at a time. All of it had led here, to this moment, to a life she'd never imagined possible when she was the half-blood daughter everyone pitied. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't claimed me in Moonveil?" she asked quietly. Kaelric was silent for a long moment. Then, "Every day. I think about how close I came to letting the curse take me, how easy it would have been to just give up and let the empire fall apart because fighting alone was too hard. And then I think about what my life would have been without you, and it's just empty, cold, nothing worth remembering. We almost didn't make it, but we did, and that's what matters." Evelyne turned to face him, and in the moonlight she could see the faint scars that remained from battles fought and survived. He carried the marks of violence on his skin the same way she carried her mother's legacy in her blood. They were both broken things that had learned to be whole together. "I love you," she said, and the words felt inadequate for the depth of what she actually felt. Not just romantic love, but partnership, trust, the bone-deep certainty that they were stronger together than apart, and that the mate bond connecting them was the best choice either of them had ever made. Kaelric's hand found hers in the darkness. "I love you too, even when you make me attend 6-hour council meetings about agricultural reform. Especially then." He laughed, and the sound was warm and genuine and completely human. No ice, no curse, just a man who'd learned to live again after 14 years of slow death. They fell asleep connected by touch and bond, and choices made deliberately every single day to keep building instead of destroying. And outside, snow fell soft and gentle over an empire that had finally learned the difference between power that controlled and power that transformed. The curse was broken. The Witch Queen's legacy had become salvation instead of revenge. And the girl everyone rejected became the queen who saved an empire, not through domination, but through the radical act of refusing to become the monster fear demanded. It was enough. It was everything. It was exactly what happened when someone brave enough to burn chose to heal instead.